Hey legends! Welcome to The Fiction Wizard. Buckle up for today's story. Molly Weasley brought Harry's blood sample to St Mungo's. 3 healers demanded arrest. A like and subscribe goes a long way. Now let's jump in. Chapter 1. The weight of wanting to fix things. The portkey dropped Harry onto the lawn of the Burrow at 11:30 at night, and he hit the ground on his hands and knees before he could stop himself. For a moment he just stayed there, palms pressed into the cool grass, breathing. The earth smelled like clover and something faintly smoky from whatever Fred and George had been burning in the garden earlier that week. Normal smells. Ordinary smells. The kind that belonged to a world where people didn't come back from graveyards with other people's fathers dead behind their eyes. He got up slowly. Dumbledore had arranged the portkey from Hogwarts directly, no fuss, no ceremony. Just a battered tin cup that had dissolved in his hand the moment it deposited him here. The old man had offered a carriage. Harry had said no. He hadn't wanted to sit inside anything that moved. He hadn't wanted company. He'd wanted grass under his feet and cold air and the specific kind of quiet that comes at the end of something terrible, where the terrible thing is over but your body hasn't gotten the message yet. The Burrow sat ahead of him, crooked and improbable and lit at the ground floor windows with the amber warmth of a kitchen that never really went dark. Someone was awake. Of course someone was awake. He'd sent an owl 2 days ago saying he was coming. He picked up his trunk and dragged it across the lawn, Hedwig's cage balanced on top, and she made a low, disapproving sound at the jostling. Sorry, he told her, and meant it for several things at once. The back door opened before he reached it. Molly Weasley stood in the doorframe wearing a dressing gown the color of old roses, her red hair loose around her shoulders, and the expression on her face when she saw him, the specific, devastated love of it, almost undid him completely. He had to look at the grass again for a second. Just a second. Harry. Her voice was very quiet. Hi, Mrs. Weasley. She crossed the garden in 3 strides and put her arms around him, and he stood there with his trunk handle in one hand and Hedwig's cage in the other and let her, because refusing would have required an explanation he didn't have language for yet. She was warm and she smelled like biscuits and something herbal, and she held on slightly too long, which was exactly right, actually. Exactly what he needed even though he hadn't known it. Come inside, she said finally, pulling back to look at his face. Whatever she found there made her jaw tighten briefly before she smoothed it into something softer. I've kept supper warm. You didn't have to, I know I didn't have to. She took Hedwig's cage from him with a firmness that didn't invite argument. Come. The kitchen was exactly as he remembered it, cluttered and warm and absurdly alive for a room with no one moving in it, the clock above the fireplace with its 9 golden hands all pointing at home, the stack of dishes that washed themselves in a slow, sudsy orbit around the sink, the smell of bread that seemed to live in the walls of this place independent of anyone actually baking. Harry sat down at the table and didn't realize how exhausted he was until the chair took his weight and his spine simply gave up. A plate appeared in front of him. Roast chicken, potatoes, something green that he was fairly sure was Mrs. Weasley's attempt at the muggle green beans his school file mentioned he liked. She sat across from him with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea and watched him eat with the careful attention of someone taking an inventory. He didn't mind. It was easier than talking. Halfway through the chicken she said, Ron's asleep. He wanted to wait up but I told him, she stopped. He'll be furious with me in the morning. That's okay, Harry said. He needs the sleep. You need sleep. I'm eating first. She smiled at that, small and real. How are you feeling? The question was so perfectly, monumentally inadequate for everything that had happened that for one strange, almost hysterical moment Harry wanted to laugh. He didn't. He said, better than I was, which was true, and, I'll be all right, which he genuinely believed, and, the food helps, which was absolutely true. She nodded like she was filing all 3 answers under acceptable but insufficient. Her eyes kept moving to his forearm, to the bandaging that Madame Pomfrey had wrapped neatly around the cut from Pettigrew's knife. Nothing serious. Shallow. But it had bled quite a lot before they'd gotten to it, and the bandage was crisp and white and unmistakably medical in a way that sat wrong against the kitchen warmth of the Burrow. He pulled his sleeve down slightly. Force of habit. She noticed. She always noticed everything, which was one of the things Harry both loved and occasionally found suffocating about her. Madame Pomfrey saw to that. Yeah. It's fine. She gave you a full diagnostic, I imagine. After everything, Madame Pomfrey is very thorough, Harry said, which was true, and also something of a redirect. The diagnostic Pomfrey had run was not a conversation he wanted to have tonight. The results had been, well. The school nurse had gone quiet in a way that she then covered with briskness, and Harry had decided not to push it because he was tired and Cedric was dead and some questions could wait. Of course she is, Molly said, and wrapped her hands tighter around her mug. Of course. He finished eating. She refilled his tea without asking. Outside, the garden was dark and the gnomes were quiet, and somewhere up the crooked staircase of this tilting house, 5 of her children were asleep, and the 6th was in Romania, and the 7th, Bill, was in Egypt, and all of them were fine, and she knew they were fine, and she was still awake at midnight watching Harry Potter eat leftover chicken because some fears don't resolve just because the disaster you were imagining didn't happen. He understood that more than she probably knew. "Thank you," he said, when the plate was empty and the tea was gone and there was nothing left to justify sitting here except that the kitchen was warm and he wasn't ready to be alone yet. "For all of this. The portkey arrangement, the room, he gestured at the plate. "Harry." She said his name like it was a full sentence. "You don't thank me for that." He almost said someone has to, but that was the kind of thing that would lead to a conversation about the Dursleys, and he didn't have the energy. So he just nodded and pushed back from the table. She showed him to the room he always shared with Ron, the orange walls, the posters, the particular smell of Chudley Cannon's memorabilia and Ron's trainers, and Ron was indeed asleep, sprawled diagonally across his bed with his mouth slightly open and one arm hanging off the edge, completely unconscious with the ease of someone who'd had a normal summer so far. Harry stood in the doorway and looked at him for a moment. Normal. Ron was so magnificently, reliably normal. "I've put fresh towels in the bathroom," Molly said softly behind him. "And there's a Didney compress on the nightstand for your arm, just press it against the bandage before you sleep, it'll help." "Thank you," he said again, quietly. "Don't thank me," she said again, just as quietly. She squeezed his shoulder once, briefly, and then she was gone back down the stairs, and Harry stepped into the orange room and set his trunk down gently so as not to wake Ron, and sat on the edge of his bed with his hands on his knees and stared at the floor. The thing about grief was that it waited. It had waited through the chaos of leaving Hogwarts and the measured kindness of Dumbledore's arrangements and the portkey and Molly's arms and the chicken and the tea. It had waited through all of it with the patience of something that knew it had nowhere to be, and now that Harry was finally alone in the dark with nothing left to do, it simply arrived. Cedric's face. The exact surprised look of it. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. "Not your fault." He'd been told this. He'd been told this by Dumbledore, by Sirius's voice through the flue, by the ghost of his own mother's voice in that terrible golden thread between wands. "Not your fault, Harry. Not your fault." He believed it on the intellectual level where things were believed when you had enough evidence. He felt it on no level at all. He lay back on the bed without changing his clothes and stared at the orange ceiling and eventually, surprisingly, against all reasonable expectation, he slept. Molly stood at the kitchen sink long after she'd heard the creak of the floorboard outside Ron's room that told her Harry had finally gone to bed. She stood there with her hands in warm water that had long since stopped being useful for dishes, and she thought about the bandage on his arm. She was not a healer. She'd had 7 children and she knew more field medicine than most witches her age, and she knew a ritual cut when she saw one. The placement, the depth described in Dumbledore's letter, a wound sustained during the events in question, shallow and healing, no cause for concern, no cause for concern. She had read that line 4 times. She also knew what Dumbledore's letters sounded like when he was categorizing something as not for sharing widely. The boy had been used. She didn't have all the details, Arthur had more, from his ministry contacts, and even he had gone quiet and grey at dinner 2 nights ago after receiving a particular owl, but she had enough. Something had taken Harry's blood. Something had needed it. He had bled into the earth of a graveyard at 14 years old, and the people responsible for him were calling it no cause for concern. She reached out and turned off the tap. It was a mother's instinct, what she did next, and she would defend it as such until the end. She was not a suspicious woman, not a calculating one. She was a woman who had 7 children and had lost sleep over every one of them at some point, and who understood, bone deep, that the people in charge did not always tell you everything, and that sometimes you had to find out for yourself. She went to the bathroom off the kitchen, the one she used for first aid, with its cabinet of files and its small cauldron for emergency poultices, and she found a clean collection vial, the kind she kept for when one of the children needed a blood panel done before Quidditch season. Standard St Mungo's kit. Little glass tube with a cork stopper and a basic preservation charm already baked into the glass. She stood in the bathroom for a moment with the vial in her hand. Then she went back to the kitchen and picked up the Didney compress she'd made for Harry's arm, and she set it down again. Not that. That felt like trespass. She went upstairs instead, slowly, and stood outside Ron's door and listened to the sounds of sleeping, 2 different rhythms of breathing, one heavy and comfortable and one quieter, slightly too controlled, the way people breathed when exhaustion had finally overridden the part of the brain that was still wound tight. She thought about the cut. She thought about what the diagnostic might show. She thought about Madame Pomfrey's silence, which Arthur had mentioned in passing, which she had not yet been able to let go of. On the dresser in the upstairs hallway, she had put it there herself, without quite thinking why, was the used gauze she'd found in the bathroom dustbin when she'd gone to put the Didney compress together. Harry must have changed his bandage when he'd first arrived. She'd noticed the fresh wrap on his arm. The old gauze had been tucked in the bin under a piece of tissue, not exactly hidden, just disposed of. It had blood on it. She stood in the hallway for a long time. Then she picked up the gauze, carried it to the bathroom, and used the collection vial to perform the standard preservation extraction, a basic charm, learned from the St Mungo's pamphlet they'd sent when she registered all 7 children as patients 20 years ago. The kind of thing you did when a child was too ill to get to hospital and you needed to bring the sample in instead. She sealed the vial. Stood with it in her palm. "I'm going to keep you safe," she said to it, or to Harry, or to the idea of him sleeping 2 doors away, still wearing his school robes, still carrying something behind his eyes that he hadn't shown anyone. "I'm just going to find out what's wrong. That's all this is." She put the vial in her dressing gown pocket and went to bed. She was asleep within minutes, the uncomplicated sleep of someone who has made a decision and told themselves it was the right one. In the morning the Burrow was its usual magnificent chaos. Fred and George had apparently spent the previous evening enchanting the garden gnomes to perform some kind of synchronized display, which had gone wrong in the specific way that Fred and George's projects always went wrong, successfully achieving the intended effect while simultaneously creating an entirely unintended one, so that by breakfast the gnomes were indeed marching in formation, but they were also on fire, mildly, in a way that didn't seem to harm them but did mean the back garden smelled strongly of something between burnt hair and very old potatoes. "It's controlled combustion," Fred said, spooning porridge into his mouth with the serene confidence of someone who had never made a mistake in his life. "It's absolutely not," said George, watching a gnome do a crisp left turn with its tiny fist blazing orange. "But it is brilliant." Ron sat across from Harry and pushed a plate of toast toward him without comment, which was the Ron equivalent of a lengthy emotional speech. Harry took 2 pieces and ate them, and Ron watched him do it with an expression of careful nonchalance, which meant he was deeply, almost painfully relieved that Harry was here and upright and consuming breakfast. They didn't talk about the graveyard. Harry was grateful for that. Ron had a gift for knowing when something needed to be left alone and when it needed to be said, and he had clearly decided that breakfast on Harry's first morning was not the moment for either. What they did talk about was gnome combustion, Quidditch, the theoretical merits of the Cannon's proposed new lineup, whether Fred had actually managed to contact a supplier in Diagon Alley for what he and George were calling the next phase of their business venture, and whether Ginny's new owl was or was not smarter than Hedwig. A debate Harry entered with more enthusiasm than its subject probably warranted because arguing about owls was something he could do without his chest clenching. Molly moved around the kitchen with her usual productive energy, toast here, more tea there, a quick swat at the twins with a dish towel when George nearly knocked over the marmalade, and she gave Harry several of those careful, inventory-taking glances that he noticed but chose not to examine too closely. She was worried about him. That was fine. That was Molly. He didn't notice the absence of the vial. He didn't notice, because he didn't know there was a vial to notice the absence of. After breakfast Ron dragged him into the garden under the pretense of showing him something Fred had built with Muggle components. It was a trebuchet, scaled down to about 2 feet tall, that could apparently launch dung bombs with remarkable accuracy, and they sat on the garden wall in the sun and lobbed things at a scarecrow for 20 minutes without talking, which was exactly the right thing to be doing. "You look terrible," Ron said eventually. "Cheers. I mean you look better than the letter sounded. But you still look terrible." Harry thought about that. "Yeah," he said honestly. "I think that's about right." Ron pulled a piece of grass off the wall and turned it in his fingers. "Mum's been, you know. Since we got the news. She's been," he made a gesture that encompassed the whole house, all of Molly's relentless feeding and organizing and motion. "You know how she gets." "I know." Harry lobbed a pebble at the scarecrow. "Missed. She's good at it, though. The feeding and all of it. It helps." Ron looked at him sideways. "Yeah. Yeah." Ron nodded, apparently satisfied with this diagnosis. "Good," he said, and they went back to the trebuchet. Ginny found them around noon and demonstrated, without being asked, that she had better aim than either of them, which Harry found unreasonably funny and Ron found offensive on a deep personal level. The three of them spent another half hour in comfortable, inconsequential competition before Molly called them in for lunch. It was, Harry thought, eating a sandwich and listening to Fred perform what he claimed was an accurate impression of the Gnome King's battle speech, a good morning. A surprisingly, almost stubbornly good morning. The kind that shouldn't be possible after the kind of week he'd had but somehow was, here, in this house. He didn't see Molly leave. He had fallen asleep after lunch, just tilted sideways on the sofa in the sitting room with a Quidditch magazine open on his chest, completely unconscious before he'd finished the article, and while he slept, while Ron dozed in the armchair across from him and Fred and George were banging around upstairs and Ginny was in the garden with a book, Molly Weasley put on her good outdoor robes, tucked the collection veil into her handbag, and slipped quietly out the front door. She took the night bus to the edge of London, operated from there to the visitors' entrance of St Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries, the dummy window of Purge and Dow's Ltd. On Muggle Oxford Street, and walked through the glass with the vial in her hand and Harry's name on her lips. St. Mungo's at midday on a Thursday was busy in the way of all hospitals, a constant low-level motion, the particular smell of potions and antiseptic and something floral that never quite covered either, the green-robed healers moving briskly between wards, the waiting families sitting in the way that people sit when they are frightened and trying to look like they aren't. Molly had been here dozens of times. Arthur's accident with the snake. Fred's engorgement charm mishap when he was 8. George's ear, she stopped herself on that one. George's ear was recent enough that even thinking about it in this building made her throat close up. She went to the general intake desk on the ground floor, spell damage, she wasn't sure which category this fell under, but the witch behind the desk with the auto-correcting quill had a kind, practiced face. "I've brought a sample," Molly said, setting her handbag on the counter and producing the vial. For a diagnostic analysis. He's not here, he couldn't come in, but he's been through a significant magical event and I wanted a full panel done. Blood diagnostics, inheritance markers, the works. The intake which took the vial and looked at the label Molly had written, H. Potter, age 14, and her eyebrows moved slightly upward. Not alarm. Just recognition of the name. Harry Potter, she said. Yes. Molly said it steadily. He's staying with us for the summer. I'm his, he's under our care. Family friend. There was a brief, careful pause in which the intake which seemed to weigh something internal and then set it aside. Of course. Full diagnostic blood panel. We'll have results within a few hours. I'll just need to copy your information for the records, and then you can wait in the family area on the second floor, or we can send an owl. I'll wait, Molly said. She went upstairs and found a chair in the family waiting area, which had the soft gray carpet and the slightly too cheerful painted walls of all hospital family areas everywhere. She took out her knitting. She always carried knitting, had carried knitting since Percy was born. It was an involuntary reflex by now, and she sat and she waited and she told herself she was doing the right thing. She got through half a sleeve before a healer appeared in the doorway and called her name. He was young, late 20s, perhaps, with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of thin, precise face that suggested someone who had been top of their class at every stage of their education. His green robes were perfectly pressed. His name badge said Augustus Pye, Healer, Spell Damage, Senior Diagnostic. He was not alone. Two other healers stood slightly behind him, one older, a gray-haired woman with reading glasses pushed up on her head, the other middle-aged and solid, a broad-shouldered man who kept his hands clasped in front of him in a way that looked deliberate. Mrs. Weasley, said Pye. Yes, Molly said, tucking her knitting away and standing. Something about the way all three of them were standing made her heart do something unpleasant. What's wrong? What did the diagnostic show? Is he, Mrs. Weasley, we need to speak with you privately. Pye's voice was measured. Professional. The voice of someone who had been trained to deliver difficult news without triggering panic. If you'd please come with us. Just tell me what's wrong, Molly said, and her voice came out more sharply than she'd intended. The three healers exchanged a look. It was the kind of look that passes between professionals when they have already had the disagreement about what to do next and reached a consensus they're not entirely comfortable with. Pye said, Mrs. Weasley, the blood diagnostics on the sample you brought in have returned results that are significant. That require immediate action. He paused. We've already sent an owl to the ministry. Molly felt the blood leave her face. The ministry, why would you? What did the patient, Pye said carefully, exhibits markers in his blood work that, under St Mungo's Protocol 7, paragraph 12, relating to the identification of active dark magical resonance within a living subject, require us to notify the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. He stopped. Seemed to weigh the next sentence. We've also included in that notification a formal recommendation. What recommendation? Molly whispered. That Harry Potter be detained, said the gray-haired healer behind Pye, in a voice without inflection, pending a full investigative workup. For public safety. The sitting room was very quiet. Molly stood with her knitting bag in her hands and stared at them. Detained, she said. Arrested, said the broad-shouldered healer, and he said it with the blunt honesty of someone who felt that detained was a euphemism that wasn't doing anyone any favors. The word in the protocol is arrested, Mrs. Weasley. The ministry will want to. He is 14 years old, Molly said. We understand that, Pye said. But the findings are, he came back from a graveyard, Molly said, and her voice was shaking now, not with fear but with something that was rapidly becoming rage. He came back from a graveyard where a classmate died and where he who must not be named, where something happened to him, something was done to him, and you ran a diagnostic on his blood and instead of, she stopped. Drew a breath. What did the diagnostic show? The three healers looked at each other again. That, said Pi, is part of what would need to be discussed with the ministry present. Molly Weasley had raised 7 children, had lived through one war and was watching the edges of another one begin, had learned to fly on a broom at age 9 and could produce a Patronus that would terrify a Dementor into giving up its career, and in this moment she felt, for the first time in a very long time, utterly and completely helpless. She had brought the sample in to help him. She had brought it in because she loved him and she was frightened for him and she thought that knowing was better than not knowing, and now 3 healers were telling her that the ministry was coming, that Aurors might come, that the boy sleeping on her sofa in last night's robes with a Quidditch magazine on his chest might be arrested before supper. She found her voice. "You will tell me," she said, with a quietness that somehow had more force than shouting, "what the diagnostic showed. I am the person who brought that sample in. I have the right to know what." "You're not his guardian," the gray-haired healer said, not unkindly. "Legally, in a case of this sensitivity, without a guardian present, then I'll go get his guardian," Molly said. "I'll flo Albus Dumbledore right now." "Hill, Mrs. Weasley." Pi's voice was very controlled. "I would advise you not to go anywhere until the ministry representative arrives. And I would advise you," he paused, and she could see him making a professional calculation, one that sat uneasily on his precise young face. "I would advise you not to tell Harry Potter about this conversation before they do. It's safer. For everyone." Molly stared at him. "Safer," she said. "Yes." She picked up her handbag. She looked at the 3 of them, at Pi's controlled precision, at the gray-haired woman's careful neutrality, at the broad-shouldered man's blunt discomfort, and she looked at them with the eyes of a woman who had just realized, in real time, the exact shape of the terrible thing she had done. "I'm going home," she said. "Mrs. Weasley, we really must ask you to." "I'm going home," she said again, and walked past them, and they let her go, because detaining her was outside their protocol, and because whatever else Augustus Pi was, he was not cruel enough to put a barrier between a mother and the child she just unwittingly put in danger. She walked down the corridor and through the doors and stepped into the lift and stood in it while it descended with the sounds of gears and the faint tinkling music that St Mungo's played in its elevators, which she had always found soothing and now found grotesque. The lobby. The glass wall. The Oxford Street pavement, sunny and muggle and indifferent. She stood on the pavement with her handbag in her hands and thought about Harry asleep on the sofa. Harry with the Quidditch magazine. Harry eating toast. Harry in the garden wall with Ron, both of them lobbing things at a scarecrow in the July sun. She had brought the sample in to help him. She said that to herself again, firmly, as though repetition might change the shape of what she'd done. Then she operated home. Harry was still asleep when she came through the front door. She stood in the doorway of the sitting room and looked at him, genuinely looked at him, with the desperate attention of someone memorizing something they might not have access to for much longer, and she saw what she always saw but was only now truly registering, the thinness of him, the shadows under his eyes, the quality of his sleep that was too deep, the sleep of someone who had given up fighting exhaustion rather than someone peacefully at rest. The scar on his forehead. Faint pink now, mostly healed over from whatever had happened in the graveyard, but there. Always there. His wand was on the cushion beside him. Even in sleep, even in this house full of people he trusted, he'd kept it within arm's reach. She turned away before she started crying in the doorway like something out of a melodrama, and she went to the kitchen and put the kettle on and stood with both hands flat on the counter and stared at the window. Outside, the gnomes were still on fire. Mild, controlled, completely irrelevant fire. George was watching them with the pleased expression of a man who has accidentally created something wonderful. The ministry owl would come tonight. Or tomorrow morning. Or later today. The owl had been sent while she was still sitting in the waiting room knitting half a sleeve, which meant it might already be in transit, which meant, the kettle began to whistle. Mrs. Weasley? She turned. Harry was in the kitchen doorway in yesterday's robes, hair even more improbable than usual, his wand tucked automatically into his pocket. He looked at her with those green eyes, sharp even muzzy with sleep, the eyes that always caught more than they were supposed to. "You went out," he said. It wasn't an accusation. He wasn't even really awake yet. He was just noting a fact with the automatic observation of someone who had grown up in an environment where tracking the movements of the adults around him had been a survival skill. "Just an errand," she said. "Tea?" "Sure." He came and sat at the table. He put his elbows on it and his chin in his hands and blinked at the window where George was now apparently trying to teach a flaming gnome to salute. Did George get them to salute? He's trying. Will it work? Something will happen, Molly said, bringing tea to the table. Whether it's what he's trying for is another question. Harry almost smiled. Not quite, but almost, the expression arriving somewhere near his eyes and not quite making it the rest of the way to his mouth, which was where it had been living since he came back. The almost smile. She set the tea down in front of him and met his eyes, and for one horrible moment she thought she was going to tell him. She thought she was going to say it. "Harry, I'm so sorry, I went to St Mungo's, I brought a sample of your blood," the healers said, the words sat in her throat like stones. She thought about Pye's controlled face. Safer for everyone. She thought about what he might mean by that, and then she stopped herself from thinking about it because if she thought about it she would have to confront what it implied about what the diagnostic had shown, and she wasn't, she couldn't. "Are you all right?" Harry asked, looking at her over his tea. Are you okay?" "Fine," she said. "Tired. It's been a busy week." He nodded slowly, and she could see him deciding to leave it alone out of the same considerateness that made him refuse to talk about his own pain, the instinct, learned and practiced, not to push on things that looked fragile. He was protecting her from his own concern. 14 years old, she thought. He is 14 years old and he is protecting me. She sat down across from him and wrapped her hands around her mug and watched him drink his tea, and she thought about the vial she'd handed to the intake witch, and she thought about Pye's 3 faces lined up in a row, and she thought about the owl already winging its way somewhere, to the ministry, to some department, to someone who would read the results that she still didn't know the content of, and decide what to do next. She had brought the sample in to help him. Harry finished his tea and went back upstairs to shower, moving through the kitchen with the particular physical awareness of someone who had recently been hurt and was still subconsciously mapping their body's borders. She heard the pipes in the walls shudder and groan as the water came on overhead. Outside, George let out a whoop that meant the saluting had either worked or exploded into something more interesting. Molly sat at the kitchen table with her cold tea and waited for an owl that she hadn't told anyone was coming, and the afternoon light moved slowly across the floor, and the clock above the fireplace showed all 9 hands pointing peacefully at home, and she thought, "What have I done?" Chapter 2, The knock at the door. The owl arrived at 6 in the morning. Harry knew it wasn't a normal owl the moment it landed on the windowsill, because normal owls didn't carry themselves like that, stiff-winged, official, the particular posture of ministry birds that had been trained to hold their scroll with both talons and wait for acknowledgement rather than simply dropping it and leaving. This one had a wax seal the color of dried blood and the logo of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement stamped on the outside of the scroll in sharp, bureaucratic black ink. He was the only one awake. He'd been up since 4, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of water, not reading the book he'd brought down with him, just sitting in the kitchen because the bedroom had gotten too quiet in the specific way that quiet gets when your brain won't stop. He looked at the owl. The owl looked at him. He got up and opened the window. The owl stepped onto the kitchen counter with the gravity of a judge taking a seat and extended its leg. Harry untied the scroll. The owl waited, which confirmed it was ministry. Ministry birds always waited for a response because the departments that sent them needed confirmation of receipt. He broke the seal. The scroll was addressed to Molly Weasley, the Burrow, Ottery Street catchpole, not to him. He read it anyway, because it was on his kitchen counter at 6 in the morning and because the seal said Magical Law Enforcement, and those were two things that together made waiting seem inadvisable. He read it twice. Then he set it on the table, very carefully, and stood there with his hands on the counter looking at the garden through the window. The gnomes were asleep. No fire. Just the grey pre-dawn quiet of a July morning, the rook starting up somewhere in the trees beyond the hedge, the sky doing its slow reluctant turn from black to the particular color of old pewter that came before actual morning. The scroll said, in the formal language of official ministry correspondence, that St Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries had submitted a request for investigative action to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement regarding a blood diagnostic panel. It said that the results of said diagnostic had triggered Protocol 7, Paragraph 12, the active dark magical resonance clause, and that as a result, Aurors were authorized, and indeed instructed, to attend the address listed for the subject, 1 Harry James Potter, age 14, for the purposes of taking him into ministry custody pending a full investigative workup. Attendance expected, the scroll said, before 9 a.m. It was 6:03. Harry went upstairs. He showered. He put on his cleanest jeans and the jumper that Mrs. Weasley had knitted him last Christmas, the dark green one with the small H, because he was cold, and because wearing it seemed to matter in some way he didn't examine too closely. He put his wand in his jeans pocket. He went back downstairs and made tea, properly this time, full pot, enough for everyone. Then he sat at the table with his tea and the ministry scroll and waited for the house to wake up. Ron came down first, as Ron often did when something was wrong, because Ron had an older sibling's sixth sense for household atmosphere. He appeared at the kitchen doorway in his pajamas with his hair doing something architecturally implausible and looked at Harry sitting at the table in a Christmas jumper at 6:40 in the morning, and then looked at the ministry scroll, and then looked at Harry again. "What's that?" he said. Harry pushed it across the table. Ron read it. He read it slowly, the way Ron always read things that he was hoping might change meaning if he gave them more time. His ears went red, but the red traveled from the ears down his neck and across his collarbones, which was different from the usual embarrassment red. This was anger, the particular Weasley anger that arrived silently and sat in the chest like something compressed. "Aurors," Ron said. "Yep. Coming here. Apparently. Before 9. That's what it says." Ron put the scroll down. He looked at the wall. "It says blood diagnostic," he said carefully. "Who?" He stopped. He looked at Harry. Harry looked back at him. "I don't know," Harry said, which was true. He had a suspicion, the same suspicion that had been sitting quietly in the back of his mind since he'd read the thing, but suspicion wasn't fact. "I didn't bring any sample to St Mungo's. I haven't been to St Mungo's." Ron's ears, if possible, went darker. He looked at the stairs. "Ron," Harry said. I don't." Ron pushed back from the table and stood up, and then sat back down again, and then looked at his hands. "Harry, if my mum, I don't know if it was your mum," Harry said. "And it doesn't matter yet. Aurors are coming at 9. That's the part that matters right now." Ron stared at him. "Doesn't matter?" "It matters," Harry amended, "but it matters second. The Aurors matter first." This was the thing about having spent 4 years in escalating danger. Harry had developed a very clear instinct for triage. There would be time for the conversation about the blood sample. That conversation was going to be painful and it was going to happen, and he was not, in any way, pretending it wasn't. But right now he had 2 hours and change before ministry officials arrived at this address to take him into custody, and that was the problem that needed solving first. "We should wake up your mum," Harry said. Ron opened his mouth. "Gently," Harry said. Ron closed his mouth. He looked at Harry with an expression that was equal parts admiration and something more complicated. Then he got up and went to the stairs. Harry heard him go up, heard the specific creak of the second from top step, heard the quiet knock on Molly and Arthur's bedroom door. He wrapped his hands around his tea and looked at the scroll again, and he thought about the blood diagnostic, and he thought about what in his blood could possibly warrant a Protocol 7 paragraph 12, and he thought about Madame Pomfrey going quiet and brisk in that specific order, and he filed all of it away for later. The morning light was beginning properly now, coming through the kitchen window in long dusty bars that fell across the stone floor and made the kitchen look warm and permanent, the kind of room that had always existed and would always exist. Harry had always liked this kitchen. He liked it now. He thought he would probably like it from a ministry holding cell, too, if it came to that, but he was reasonably confident it wasn't going to come to that. He was not going to be arrested. He was going to open the door when the Aurors knocked and he was going to talk to them, and whatever the blood diagnostic had shown, it had been done to him, not by him, and those were two fundamentally different things that he was fully prepared to make very clear. He heard Molly's voice upstairs. Low, initially. Then not low. She came down the stairs ahead of Ron, and the moment Harry saw her face, he knew. Not a suspicion anymore. She came into the kitchen in her dressing gown, her red hair loose, and she looked at Harry sitting at the table in his Christmas jumper with the ministry scroll in front of him, and she stopped in the doorway with one hand on the frame and her face did something complicated and then went still. Harry, she said. Mrs. Weasley, he said. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a rook landed heavily on the garden wall and then left again. How much of it did you read? She asked. All of it, he said. It was addressed to you. I read it anyway. She nodded slowly. She came to the table and sat down across from him, and she folded her hands on the table in front of her the way people do when they're trying to stay measured. Ron came and stood in the corner by the cold range, and his face was a carefully maintained blankness that cost him visible effort. I went to St Mungo's yesterday, she said. While you were sleeping. I know. I had a sample. Of your blood. From the gauze, when you changed your bandage. She looked at her hands. I wanted a full diagnostic. I wanted to know what had been done to you. After everything at the graveyard. I thought if I knew what the magic had, if I could see it in the blood work. She stopped. I was trying to help you. Harry said nothing. Molly looked up. Whatever she expected to find on his face, fury, betrayal, tears, it wasn't what was actually there, which was a kind of quiet attention that was somehow harder to meet than anger would have been. He was listening to her. Fully, carefully, with both eyes on her face and his tea cooling in front of him. Harry, I'm sorry, she said. I know this is not, I made a decision that wasn't mine to make. It's your blood, your body, what did they tell you? Harry said. The healers. What did they say the diagnostic showed? Molly blinked. They wouldn't tell me. They said they couldn't discuss the results without your guardian present, and then they said they'd sent the ministry owl, and then they told me not to tell you before the ministry, they told you not to warn me. Yes. Harry picked up his tea. He drank some of it. He set the mug back down. But you came home and didn't tell me. The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. Molly's hands tightened on the table. I didn't know what to say, she whispered. You could have said what you just said. Exactly what you just said. I know. Her voice was very small. I know that, Harry. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back, and there was nothing defensive in her now, just the stark, unguarded face of someone waiting for whatever they deserve. He thought about what it took to sit like that. He thought about Fred and George setting gnomes on fire and Ron's architect hair and the green jumper he was wearing and the 7 clocks that always said home. Okay, he said. She blinked. Okay. We'll talk about it properly. After. He looked at the scroll. Right now I need to know if you remember anything about what those healers said. Anything at all. What they looked like when they came to find you, what words they used. Molly straightened slightly. There were 3 of them. The lead one was young, late 20s, maybe. Very precise. His name badge said Augustus Pye. Senior Diagnostic. She paused. He said the results triggered Protocol 7, Paragraph 12. Active dark magical resonance within a living subject. Dark magical resonance, Harry repeated. In a living subject, she said, and the words clearly hurt her to say out loud. Harry nodded slowly. What else? The woman, older, gray hair, she said you needed to be detained. Molly's voice went tight. And the third one, a bigger man, he said, he used the word arrested. Said detained was a euphemism. She paused. Pye looked uncomfortable with that. Interesting, Harry said. Interesting? Ron said from the corner, breaking his silence for the first time. Harry, they want to arrest you. How is that interesting? Because Pye looked uncomfortable, Harry said. Which means he's not just following orders without thinking about them. Which means he might actually be willing to have a conversation. He picked up the scroll. And conversation is what I want. Ron stared at him. You want to have a conversation with the Aurors who are coming to arrest you. I want to have a conversation with everyone, yeah. You're going to let them in. I'm going to open the door. Harry, Ron. Harry looked at his best friend, and something in his voice or his face settled something in Ron's, because Ron stopped arguing and just stood there looking slightly awed and slightly terrified in roughly equal measure, which was not an unusual state for Ron where Harry was concerned. How long before your dad gets back from the ministry? He had the overnight shift. Molly looked at the kitchen clock. All the hands still said home, which meant, an hour. Maybe less. Good. Harry stood up. I need parchment. I'm going to write 3 owls. 1 to Dumbledore. 1 to Sirius. He paused. And 1 to someone else. Who? Molly asked. Amelia Bones. Molly and Ron looked at each other. The head of magical law enforcement? Ron said. She has a reputation, Harry said, going to the kitchen drawer where the writing supplies lived under a pile of rubber bands and Arthur's muggle plugs. Dumbledore mentioned her. She's known for going off evidence. Actually running her own cases rather than rubber stamping what the departments want. He found parchment, found a quill that wasn't too split. And she has authority over Aurors. How do you know that? Ron asked. Hermione wrote me about her last summer. Did a whole thing about the DMLE structure after the Dementor incident. He paused. Hermione researches things. Even things that seem irrelevant at the time. He sat back down and started writing. Molly watched him for a moment, then got up quietly and started making breakfast. He could hear her moving around the kitchen, the bread box, the butter, the cast iron pan that weighed approximately as much as a small child, and he wrote steadily through all of it, 3 letters, each one different in tone and detail, all of them precise. The letter to Dumbledore was brief, something's happened. Aurors coming at 9. Blood diagnostic from St Mungo's, Protocol 7. I'd appreciate your presence. H.P. The letter to Sirius was less brief and contained significantly more understandable profanity, which Harry edited out on the second draft because Sirius had a tendency to do things like show up in person when the letter alarmed him, and a wanted criminal in Azkaban Grey appearing at the Burrow on the same morning as Ministry Aurors would complicate things past the point of useful. The final version said, "Don't do anything. I'll write again by noon. Keep safe. Harry." The letter to Amelia Bones took the longest. He'd never written to her before and she had no reason to take a letter from him seriously, so he had to make every word count. He explained what the scroll said, the diagnostic, the protocol, the timeline. He said he wasn't running and he wasn't hiding, but he wanted someone in the DMLE who was willing to look at evidence rather than just enforce the protocol. He said he thought she was that person and he hoped he was right. He said he was willing to be examined, interviewed, and scrutinized to any standard she wanted to apply, but he would not be taken into custody without someone in authority understanding exactly what they were doing and why. He signed it Harry Potter and underlined it once, because underlining it once seemed about right. He sent all 3 owls before 7, using Hedwig for Dumbledore, the household owl for Sirius, and a spare barn owl he borrowed from the Weasley owl post in the garden for Bones. Then he ate breakfast. Arthur came home at 7:10, still in his ministry robes, smelling of the particular combination of Flo powder and late-night committee rooms. He read the scroll. He read it standing at the kitchen counter and he set it down and looked at his wife, and the look that passed between them was the kind that required no words because they had been married long enough to have developed a shared language of glances, and this particular glance was saying something along the lines of I need to know exactly what happened and I need you to tell me now. Molly told him in the kitchen while Harry and Ron sat in the garden with their breakfasts and pretended not to be able to hear through the open window. Arthur's voice was very quiet and very careful for the entire conversation. That was how you knew he was genuinely upset, not the shouting, but the quietness, the measured words that cost him visible effort. He didn't consent, was one of the things Harry heard. I know, Molly said. You collected it without telling him. I know. Molly, Arthur. I know. A long pause. I'm not defending it, she said, quieter. I'm not asking you to. I know what I did. Another pause. The healers sent an owl before they even called you back to discuss the results properly? Before. I was still waiting when Pi came to find me. Protocol 7, Arthur said, and the way he said it, the tightness of it, told Harry that Arthur knew what Protocol 7 meant in practice. That protocol is meant for when they discover active dark spell contamination in someone who comes in injured. It's a crisis response. Running it on a stored sample from he stopped. Those healers acted badly. They were frightened, Molly said. Being frightened doesn't make it right. And it doesn't, he stopped again. Harry is going to need, I know, Molly said, for the 4th time. He's not going to need managing, Arthur said. He's going to need people standing next to him. There's a difference. Harry stopped pretending not to listen and just listened. I know that too, Molly said. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. Ron was looking at his toast. My mum, he said quietly, to the toast, makes really bad decisions for really good reasons sometimes. I know, Harry said. It doesn't mean she gets a pass. I know that too. Ron looked up. Are you actually angry? Because you don't seem angry. Harry thought about that. He thought about it properly, checking in with the thing in his chest that he'd learned to track, the thermometer feeling that told him when he was about to do something he'd regret. It was there. The anger was there. It wasn't explosive, it was cold and structural, the kind of anger that had a shape to it, that lived in the knowledge that his body had been treated as data to be collected without his knowledge or permission, that someone had taken something of his while he slept. I'm angry, he said. Yeah. I am. But you're not. I'm not angry at your mum in a way that's useful right now, Harry said. And I'm not angry in a way that's going to help with the Aurors. So I'm putting it somewhere else for the moment. Ron looked at him for a long second. Sometimes you're actually terrifying, you know that? Fred says that too. Fred means it as a compliment. So do you. Ron went back to his toast. When did you get like this? He said, not really asking. When did you stop being scared? Harry offered. I was going to say reactive, Ron said carefully. But yeah. Scared too. Harry looked at the garden. The gnomes were waking up, stumbling out of the vegetable patch without any fire this morning, just their usual blundering aggression, one of them immediately walking headfirst into the garden wall and bouncing backward and shaking its small fist. He watched it for a moment. I'm still scared sometimes, he said. I was scared in the graveyard. Terrified. He paused. But being scared doesn't mean you run. And it doesn't mean you let people make decisions for you. He stopped. Started again. I've spent a lot of time letting people make decisions about me. I think that's done now. Ron was quiet for a moment. Good, he said finally. Just that. At 8:45, a knock came at the front door. It was not aggressive. Not a hammering. Just a knock, 4 knocks, measured, official. The kind that knew you were inside and was prepared to wait. Arthur was in the sitting room, still in his ministry robes, having decided that going to change felt like a form of retreat. Fred and George had appeared at the sound of the owl that morning. News traveled fast inside the Burrow's walls, and were stationed at the top of the stairs with their arms crossed and their faces uncharacteristically serious. Ginny was in the sitting room doorway. Ron was beside Harry. Molly was in the kitchen. Harry crossed the hall and opened the front door. 2 Aurors. Both in the standard dark robes with the ministry seal. One was a broad, dark-skinned woman with her hair cropped close and a face that gave away precisely nothing. The other was a younger man, fair-haired, who looked at Harry and then looked at his shoes in a way that suggested he had complicated feelings about this assignment. Behind them, on the garden path, was Augustus Pye. He wasn't in Auror robes, he was in his St Mungo's green, slightly incongruous against the garden, his name badge catching the morning light. He'd come himself. Harry hadn't expected that. Harry Potter, said the woman Auror. Yes, Harry said. I'm Senior Auror Dawlish. You're not Dawlish, Harry said. Dawlish is older and his file picture shows a mustache. I saw it in the Prophet. A pause. A very small pause. I'm Senior Auror Torres, the woman said, without any particular reaction to being corrected. This is Auror Rivet. We have a ministry order authorizing. I read the scroll, Harry said. You can come in. He stepped back. Torres and Rivet exchanged a brief look, the look of people who had prepared for several scenarios and not this one, and then they came in. Pye followed, and Harry let him, and then closed the door. The Weasley family had arranged themselves, Harry noticed, in the manner of people who had not coordinated but had arrived at the same conclusion independently. Arthur in the sitting room entrance, upright and calm. Fred and George at the top of the stairs, weight forward. Ginny in the doorway. Ron directly behind Harry's left shoulder, which was where Ron went when things were serious. Molly came from the kitchen. Torres took in all of this without expression. Rivet looked at his shoes again. Pye looked at Harry. Harry looked back at him steadily. You ran my blood panel, Harry said to him. Pye didn't flinch. Yes. What did it show? Mr. Potter, what did it show? Not louder. Just the same, exact tone, with the quality of something that intended to be answered. Pye looked at Torres. Torres looked at Harry and seemed to be making a rapid internal assessment that arrived, after a second, at something like respect. He has a right to know, she said flatly, to Pye. Pye straightened his jacket. The diagnostic panel returned 3 significant anomalies, he said. First, your blood contains inheritance markers that don't correspond to any recorded bloodline in our database. Not Potter, not Evans, not any affiliated line. The markers are ancient, pre-ministry ancient, and they are active, meaning they're doing something, not just passive heritage identifiers. He paused. Second. There is a magical resonance in your blood that corresponds, in the theoretical literature, to a soul anchor. A fragment of external magical consciousness embedded in living tissue. The sitting room was very quiet. A Horcrux, Arthur said from the doorway. Pye looked at him. The word is used in very restricted literature. Yes. Or, the resonance consistent with that theory. And the third? Harry said. Pi looked back at him. Parseltongue-encoded magic, he said. Woven into your cellular structure. Not a curse, not an imposition, it's structural. It's part of how your magic functions at the base level. Harry nodded slowly. And these three things together, he said, made you think arrest. The protocol, I'm not asking about the protocol, Harry said. I'm asking about your thinking. You looked at a 14-year-old boy's blood work and your first call was to the ministry rather than, what? Asking who had done this to him. Trying to understand what had happened? Pi's jaw tightened. The protocol exists because active dark magical resonance in a living subject represents a potential public safety. It represents something that was done to me, Harry said. The words came out clean and level. In a graveyard. By Voldemort. Several people flinched at the name. Harry ignored it. He used my blood in a ritual to return to his body. That's where the resonance is from. That's why the markers look wrong, because someone performed magic on me without my consent, in the same way that someone collected my blood sample without my consent. He looked at Molly when he said this. She met his eyes. And the response to finding evidence of a crime committed against me is to arrest me for it? The silence that followed this had a different quality than the silence before it. Torres said, carefully, that's a reasonable characterization of the situation. Rivet had stopped looking at his shoes. Pi said nothing for a moment. His face was doing something complicated. Harry watched it and thought about what Molly had said. He looked uncomfortable, and thought about Amelia Bones's owl, which he hadn't heard back from yet, and thought about Dumbledore, who also hadn't replied yet, and thought about the fact that right now, in this hallway, he had two Aurors and a healer who were beginning to look like people who had been sent to do something and were having serious second thoughts. If you want me examined, Harry said to Pi, I'll come to St Mungo's and be examined properly. Full workup. You can ask me questions, you can run any diagnostic you want, I'll answer everything honestly. He looked at Torres. But I'm not going into ministry custody. Not without a formal charge. And there is no formal charge because I haven't done anything. Torres looked at him for a long time. The ministry order is an investigative hold order, Arthur said quietly from the doorway. He'd clearly been waiting to speak, and when he did his voice was very measured. Not an arrest warrant. There's a difference in law. An investigative hold requires the subject's cooperation, not their custody. Harry is offering cooperation. He looked at Torres steadily. Is that sufficient for you? Torres looked at Rivet. Rivet looked at Harry. Harry looked at Pi. Pi said, if Mr. Potter will submit to a full diagnostic examination at St Mungo's, voluntary, scheduled, with counsel or guardians present, I believe that satisfies the requirements of the initial investigative protocol. When? Harry said. Today, Pi said. If possible. This afternoon, Harry said. 2 o'clock. I'll want my school headmaster present, and Mr. Weasley. He looked at Arthur. Arthur nodded. And I want access to the written results. Everything the diagnostic showed. I want to see it myself. Pi opened his mouth, clearly wanting to point out some procedural reason why that was complicated, and then closed it again. He looked at Harry and seemed to be revising something. That can be arranged, he said. Good. Harry stepped back from the door. Do you want tea? The silence this time was almost funny. Tea, Torres repeated. You've been standing on a garden path for 10 minutes, Harry said. It's almost 9 in the morning. You probably didn't have breakfast before this call out. He looked at Rivet. You didn't, did you? Rivet looked startled. No, he admitted. Kitchen's through there, Harry said. Mrs. Weasley makes excellent tea. Molly, who had been silent through all of this, standing at the edge of the hallway with her hands clasped and her face doing something that wasn't quite any one emotion but contained all of them, looked at Harry, and then at the Aurors, and seemed to arrive at a decision by default. "Yes," she said, with the automatic hospitality of a woman who could not watch people standing in her house without feeding them regardless of circumstances. "Come through. I've got a pot on." Torres looked at Rivet again. Rivet made an infinitesimal shrug that said, "I don't know what else to do here," she said. "Tea." They came through. Pi lingered in the hallway. Harry lingered with him. "The other two healers," Harry said, quietly, once the others were in the kitchen. "The ones who were with you yesterday." "The older woman, she's the one who said detained. The big man who said arrested. Were those their instincts or were they following a process?" Pi looked at him. "Why does that matter?" "Because it matters whether your department has a protocol problem or a people problem," Harry said. "They're different things with different solutions." Pi was quiet for a moment. "Dr. Ellsworth, the woman, she follows protocol absolutely. She always has. She's not cruel. She just believes in process." He paused. "Healer Croft, the other, he's had cases before. People who came in presenting as victims who turned out to be the source of the damage. He was operating from that framework." "And you?" Pi looked at the kitchen doorway. "I ran the diagnostic," he said. "I'm the one who saw the results first. I'm the one who I didn't handle the next 30 seconds well." He turned back to Harry. "I've been a senior diagnostic healer for 3 years. I've never seen results like yours. I reacted badly. You sent the Ministry owl before you spoke to Mrs. Weasley about the results." "Yes. She didn't even know what the diagnostic showed before you called the DMLE." "I know. You were going to have me arrested based on findings that no one had given me a chance to explain," Harry said. "You didn't know about the graveyard. You didn't ask what had happened to me. You just saw the markers and jumped to the worst possible interpretation." Pi held his gaze. "Yes," he said. "That's accurate." Harry studied him. "Are you good at your job?" he asked. Pi blinked. Yes. "Do you actually want to understand what those markers mean?" "Yes." More steadily this time. "Then this afternoon might actually be useful," Harry said. "Not just for the Ministry. For both of us." He looked at the kitchen. "Tea first, though." He walked into the kitchen. After a moment, Pi followed. The letter from Dumbledore arrived at 9:15, carried by a school owl that swooped through the open kitchen window with the theatrical timing of something that had been practiced. The kitchen, by now, contained 2 Aurors eating toast, 1 healer drinking tea and looking thoughtful, 4 Weasley children at various points of wary observation, Arthur in his ministry robes, and Molly moving between the kettle and the counter in the careful, purposeful way of someone who needed to be doing something. Harry read Dumbledore's reply at the counter. "Harry. I have already spoken with the Ministry this morning. I will meet you at St Mungo's at 2 o'clock. I am aware of the diagnostic results. There are things I should have told you sooner. I regret that circumstance, rather than choice, has forced this conversation. I will explain everything." Harry folded the letter. "There are things I should have told you sooner." He'd have to think very carefully about what that sentence meant. The specific shape of it, not "I knew some of this but I should have told you," was its own kind of admission. Dumbledore had known something. Had chosen not to share it. The reasons for that choice were going to be interesting. He tucked the letter in his pocket. At the kitchen table, Torres was on her second piece of toast and Rivet was telling George, in response to some question Harry had missed, that Auror training included a full module on Muggle law enforcement techniques, which George appeared to find absolutely fascinating. Fred was listening from the counter with the expression of someone filing information for future use. Pi had his diagnostic notebook out and was making notes without, apparently, being aware he was doing it. Molly set a fresh pot of tea on the table and sat down. She looked at Harry across the kitchen. He looked back at her. The conversation they still needed to have was sitting between them, visible but set aside. Later, Harry said, with his eyes. She nodded. He sat down. He drank his tea. Around him the Burrow's kitchen held its usual warm impossible life, the self-washing dishes, the clock, the smell of toast and morning, and at the table sat two ministry aurors eating breakfast that wasn't theirs, and across from them sat a healer who had tried to have Harry arrested and was now on his second cup of tea and making notes that might, Harry suspected, eventually contribute to something actually useful. Ron materialized at Harry's shoulder with a piece of toast and put it in front of him without comment. Harry ate it. 2:00, Ron said quietly, behind him. 2:00, Harry confirmed. I'm coming. I know you are. And we're going to find out what's in your blood. Yeah, Harry said. We are. And then, Ron said, very quietly so only Harry could hear, when this is all sorted, you and my mom are going to have a conversation. I know. And you're going to be fair to her, Ron said, and there was something in his voice, something that was both asking and requiring at the same time. The voice of someone who loved two people and was frightened of what the truth was going to cost everyone. Harry looked at his toast. I'm going to be honest with her, he said. That's the best I can do. Ron was quiet for a moment. That's enough, he said finally. Outside the kitchen window the July morning had gone gold and ordinary, the garden bright and the gnomes quarrelsome and the trees beyond the hedge moving in a slow, irrelevant wind. Somewhere above London an owl was almost certainly winging its way back from Amelia Bones's office, carrying whatever she'd decided to say. Harry drank his tea and waited to find out what the world was going to do with the truth about his blood. He'd been waiting his whole life, one way or another. The difference was, this time, he wasn't afraid of the answer. Chapter 3, The room that knew St Mungo's at 2 in the afternoon was a different creature from St Mungo's at midnight. The lobby moved with the particular energy of a hospital at full operational capacity, families clustered around the information desk, a healer striding past with a levitated tray of files, somewhere deeper in the building a child crying with the specific intensity of someone who had been crying long enough that they'd stopped caring who heard. The enchanted welcome sign above the reception desk cycled through its usual categories: creature-induced injuries, artifact accidents, potions and plant poisoning, spell damage, magical bugs and diseases. Harry read all of them while they waited for someone to come and collect them from the lobby. He'd come with Arthur, Ron, and Dumbledore, who had materialized outside the hospital's Muggle front entrance at 1:58 with his half-moon glasses and his extraordinary robes and the general quality of a man who had been expecting this particular Tuesday for some time. He'd put a hand on Harry's shoulder in greeting and Harry had let him, and they hadn't said anything, which suited Harry fine. There would be time for saying things. He preferred to do it in the right order. Pi met them at the lift. He looked like he'd been at the hospital since before his shift officially started. There was a quality of sustained alertness to him, the look of someone running on their second coffee and their first anxiety. He greeted Dumbledore with a nod that was not quite a bow but in that territory. He greeted Arthur with the professional warmth of people who existed in adjacent government spaces. He looked at Ron and said nothing, which was fine because Ron looked at him with the expression of someone reserving judgment and meaning it very specifically. He looked at Harry last. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You sent ministry aurors to my house this morning," Harry said pleasantly. "So I feel like thank you might be doing some heavy lifting there. But let's get on with it." Pi had the expression of a man who had decided he deserved that and moved on. He pressed the lift button. They rode up to the 4th floor, spell damage, and then through a set of double doors that Harry hadn't been through before, past the regular wards with their curtained bays, to a corridor that was noticeably quieter. The floors here were the same polished stone, the walls the same pale green of all hospital corridors, but the doors were thicker and the nameplates beside them were the small discreet kind that didn't invite reading. The room Pi brought them to was at the end of the corridor. It was not what Harry expected. He'd been bracing for something clinical and hostile: bare surfaces, too much light, the architecture of examination rooms that were designed for subject rather than patient. What he found instead was large and high-ceilinged, with windows along one wall that looked out on the back of a London building opposite, its brick face warm in the afternoon sun. There was a table, proper solid wood, not the paper-covered medical kind, with 6 chairs around it. There was a diagnostic bed along the far wall with the instrumentation above it, but it was positioned as a piece of equipment in a room rather than as the room's entire purpose. It was, Harry thought, a room that someone had deliberately made more human before they brought him here. He looked at Pi. Pi said, "I reorganized it this morning. The standard diagnostic suite is..." He stopped. The standard layout didn't feel appropriate. Ron made a small sound beside Harry that might have been surprise. "Thank you," Harry said, and meant it. He sat at the table. The others arranged themselves, Dumbledore to his left, Arthur to his right, Ron claiming the chair at the corner in his habitual way of trying to be simultaneously present and non-intrusive. Pi sat across from Harry and opened his notebook. The other 2 healers, Dr. Ellsworth and Healer Croft, who Harry recognized from Molly's description, were already in the room, standing near the windows. Ellsworth had her arms folded and her reading glasses on, her face professionally neutral. Croft was leaning against the wall with the posture of someone who had decided to observe. Neither of them said anything. Harry looked at the diagnostic equipment on the far wall. A complex series of calibrated instruments, spheres of clear glass that would fog or change color in response to magical markers, a silver arm that would extend to take readings directly from the subject, and above the bed a layered matrix of detection charms suspended in a frame of pale wood. He recognized the basic structure from Madame Pomfrey's equipment, scaled up to something significantly more sophisticated. "Before we start," Harry said, "I want to see the results from yesterday's panel." Pi glanced at Dumbledore, then back at Harry. "I'll show you everything as we go through, now," Harry said. "I want to see the raw results from what you ran yesterday. Before we do anything else." He paused. "You told me this morning that you made a mistake in how you handled the initial findings. One way to correct that is to stop managing my access to information about my own body." Another small sound from Ron. This one was definitely not surprise. Ellsworth unfolded her arms briefly, then refolded them. Croft, from the wall, made no visible movement, but Harry had the impression of reassessment. Pi reached into his notebook and produced a folded chart, proper diagnostic parchment, the kind that printed itself during the analysis with the readings in columns and the interpretation notes beside them. He slid it across the table. Harry unfolded it. The diagnostic chart was dense, columns of figures and shorthand notation, with the interpretation in a smaller hand beside each row, presumably Pi's own notes made during the analysis. Harry had spent enough time in Madame Pomfrey's Bay over 4 years to understand medical shorthand better than any student his age probably should, and he worked through the chart methodically. Inheritance markers: active, unlisted, pre-classification era. Cross-reference to Founders period, flagged as anomalous, no match in current database. Soul resonance, secondary magical consciousness detected, embedded in scar tissue, origin external, nature dark. Cross-reference to, Pi had written 2 theoretical sources here in his note margin, both from restricted texts. Harry looked at the second one more carefully. Horcrux theory, Herpo the Foul, see also Secrets of the Darkest Art. Parseltongue marker, structural, cellular, non-cursed. Note in the margin said, unlike any imposition I've seen, this isn't a curse layer, it's foundational. As if the magic itself has been rewritten at the base level. He read that note twice. Then he looked up at Pi. "The Parseltongue marker," he said. "You wrote it's foundational. Not a curse." "Correct. Meaning it's not something that was done to me recently." "No," Pi said. That particular marker has the age signature of something from infancy. Or earlier, theoretically. It's older than any other component in your blood work. Older than the soul resonance? Yes. The soul resonance it has a clear event horizon. One point in time. We estimated at approximately 13 years ago, based on the decay pattern of the embedding. He paused. The Knight Voldemort, he stumbled slightly on the name. Harry waited. The night of the attack on your home. The resonance was embedded then. The night my parents died. Yes. Dumbledore had not said a word since sitting down. Harry glanced at him. The old man was looking at the table with an expression that was very still and very focused, the expression of someone listening to something they already knew being said aloud for the first time. Harry looked back at the chart. The inheritance markers, he said. Pre-classification era. Founders period. What does that mean exactly? Pi leaned forward slightly. It means that somewhere in your ancestry, and we're talking distant, very distant, pre-ministry pre-classification, there's a bloodline that our current database doesn't have records for. The markers are active, which means they're not just heritage signifiers. They're doing something functional in your magical structure. He hesitated. In theory, and I want to be clear this is theoretical, we're in very limited literature here, pre-classification bloodlines occasionally carried what the old texts called primary magic. Before the standardized categories were established. Before the ministry existed. Some magical families carried abilities that didn't fit neatly into any modern classification. Harry stared at him. You're saying I have abilities that your system doesn't have a category for. I'm saying your blood suggests it's possible, Pi said carefully. Which is why the protocol flagged it as dark resonance, Arthur said from beside Harry, his voice quiet and tight. Because if it doesn't fit the classification system, the default assumption is unregistered dark magic. Yes. Pi looked at Arthur. That's a flaw in the protocol, he said, and he said it clearly, without hedging. I'm aware of it. I intend to submit a formal review. I'd like to be part of that review, Harry said. Pi blinked. You'd like to? I have a stake in what the protocol says about people whose blood work doesn't fit the database, Harry said. I'd like to be part of the conversation about how it gets changed. He paused. After we've figured out what my blood actually is. Ellsworth made a sound from the window. Not words, just a small, involuntary sound of someone recalibrating. Harry looked at her and she met his eyes, and hers were sharp and gray and, he thought, considerably more engaged than they'd been when he walked in. You said there are things you should have told me sooner, Harry said. He wasn't looking at Pi anymore. He was looking at Dumbledore. The room shifted slightly in the way rooms shift when the gravity of a conversation changes. Dumbledore looked up. His blue eyes, behind the glasses, were the careful eyes of a man who had been preparing for this moment and was finding it harder than he'd anticipated. Yes, he said. Which parts do you know? Most of it, Dumbledore said. The inheritance markers, I have a theory about the bloodline they correspond to, though I've never been able to prove it. The soul resonance, he paused. Yes. I've known about that for some years. Harry said nothing. He let the silence sit. You knew, Arthur said, and his voice had a quietness to it that was considerably more pointed than shouting, that Harry had a fragment of Voldemort's soul embedded in his scar. I suspected, Dumbledore said. Strongly. For several years. And you didn't tell him? No. Why? Harry asked. Just the one word. Dumbledore looked at him steadily. Because I believed that if you knew, it would change how you lived. It would change how you faced each day. I thought the knowledge would be a weight you shouldn't have to carry before it became necessary. Harry held his gaze. That's not your choice to make, he said. No, Dumbledore said. It isn't. I know that. You decided what I could handle without asking me. Yes. You did exactly what Mrs. Weasley did. Just with more information and longer lead time. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. That is, he said, a precise and fair comparison. Harry turned back to Pi. All right, he said. Let's run the new diagnostic. Full panel. I want to understand everything the equipment can tell us, and I want Pi to explain everything in real time, and I want the results in writing when we're done. He stood from the table. And I want the actual name of the preclassification bloodline you're theorizing about, he added, looking at Dumbledore. Your theory. Not later. Now. Before we run anything. Dumbledore said, Merlin. The word dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Ron said, sorry, what? The preclassification bloodline, Dumbledore said, in the voice of a man who has been sitting on a piece of information for so long that saying it aloud feels strange. The markers in Harry's blood correspond, in the theoretical literature, to the family of Merlin. Not the legend, the man. Emery's. Who existed, was real, and whose descendants existed for several centuries after him before the line was thought to have died out. He looked at Harry over his glasses. It appears it did not. Harry sat back down. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. He genuinely wasn't. He'd been steeling himself for something difficult, another piece of Voldemort, another wound, another thing done to him that he'd have to figure out how to carry. He had not been steeling himself for this. Pi was writing in his notebook very rapidly. Ellsworth had uncrossed her arms. Croft had pushed off the wall. Ron was staring at Dumbledore with his mouth slightly open. Merlin, he said, and then looked at Harry, and then looked back at Dumbledore. As in, Merlin's beard. That Merlin. Yes, Dumbledore said. Harry is, distantly descended, yes. In all probability. That's, Ron seemed to be searching for a word and coming up with nothing adequate. He settled for looking at Harry with an expression that contained pure, uncomplicated, astonished delight. Mate, he said. Ron, Harry said. I'm just saying. You can say it later. I know, but, Merlin. Later. Pi cleared his throat. Not impatiently, it was the throat clear of someone who was vibrating with professional excitement and was doing his best to contain it. If I can, the diagnostic bed. If you're ready. I'd like to run the full panel now, while the preliminary results are fresh, so we can cross-reference in real time. Harry stood again and crossed to the diagnostic bed. He sat on it, and the paper cover crinkled under him with the universal hospital sound that somehow made him feel briefly and unexpectedly human. He looked at the instrumentation array above him, the glass spheres, the silver arm, the charm matrix, and he thought about what they were about to find. A piece of Voldemort in his scar. A bloodline from before the Ministry existed. Magic so old it predated categories. Will this hurt? He asked. No, Pi said. You might feel warmth in the scar area when we scan that region. The soul resonance reading is, it responds to the scan. It becomes briefly active. But it won't be painful. All right. Harry lay back. The ceiling above the diagnostic bed was plain and white and had a small water stain in one corner shaped vaguely like a handprint. He stared at it. Go ahead. The diagnostic began. It took 40 minutes. Pi narrated throughout, not in the clipped professional shorthand of someone performing a procedure, but in the genuinely engaged voice of someone working through something in real time and thinking aloud. He described each reading as it came up on the instruments. He explained what the glass spheres did when they changed color, the first one going a deep amber that he said indicated the inheritance markers active and layered, far denser than a standard reading, the second one doing something Harry had never seen glass do, which was emit a low musical tone as well as shifting to a dark, resonant purple that Pi said indicated the soul resonance, which was exactly as he'd found it in the blood panel but stronger now, reading directly from the source. The warmth in his scar was exactly as Pi had described, not painful, just a peculiar sense of pressure, of something that didn't belong pressing briefly against the inside of whatever it was housed in. Harry breathed through it. Arthur, at the table, had his hands folded and was watching with the face of someone who was doing their absolute best to stay measured and not succeeding completely. Ron had his elbows on the table and was leaning forward. Dumbledore sat with his hands in his lap and his eyes on Harry, and there was something in his face, watching Harry hold still under the diagnostic, watching him breathe through the scar pressure, watching him study the ceiling with focused calm, that was not quite guilt but was adjacent to it. The third instrument, the charm matrix, reacted to the Parseltongue marker differently from the others. It didn't change color or produce sound. Instead, the entire frame shifted slightly, a physical tilt of about 15 degrees, as though the charm at its center was orienting toward Harry the way a compass needle orients toward north. Pi stopped writing. He stood and stared at it. "That's new," he said. "What does it mean?" Harry asked. "It means the marker is active," Pi said slowly. "It means it's responding. The charm matrix measures magical alignment. It's meant to show whether a magical signal is being emitted or received. If it tilts toward you, that means he paused. "You're broadcasting. Very low level. Constant. Like a signal that's always on." "Broadcasting what?" Harry asked. "I don't know," Pi said, and he said it with the voice of someone who found not knowing simultaneously alarming and deeply interesting. "Something in your magic is always present. Always projecting outward at a subperceptible level." He looked at the matrix. "It could be the inheritance markers, active as they are. It could be an expression of the preclassification bloodline." He looked at Dumbledore. "Have you ever seen this before?" Dumbledore looked at the matrix. "Once," he said. "Years ago. I won't specify who." He looked at Harry. "But yes. Once. Was it someone with a similar bloodline?" Pi asked. "That is a question," Dumbledore said, "I'd rather discuss when there are fewer people in the room." He said it without any particular drama, just quietly, as a statement of fact, and Pi, to his credit, nodded and wrote something and moved on. The diagnostic concluded. Pi withdrew the silver arm, noted the final readings, and the glass spheres dimmed back to their standard clear state, the last traces of purple fading slowly like smoke dissipating. Harry sat up. "Well," he said. "Well," Pi said, and for a moment they looked at each other and Harry thought that under different circumstances, if this had started differently, if Pi had run the initial panel and come to him rather than straight to the ministry, this could have been a genuinely interesting professional relationship. Maybe it still would be. "Summary," Harry said. Pi looked at his notes. "You have a fragment of Voldemort's soul embedded in your scar. It's not dominant, it's not controlling or significantly influencing you, as far as I can detect, but it's there, it's real, and it's been there for approximately 13 years. He paused. "You have a bloodline inheritance from what appears to be the Merlin line, pre-classification, pre-ministry, and active. It's expressed in your magic at a structural level. It's not a curse or an imposition. It's just what you are." He looked up. "And your entire magical system is broadcasting on a frequency I can't categorize, which I believe is an expression of that inheritance." He closed his notebook. "And you have all three of these things simultaneously. Which is, in my professional experience, unprecedented." "In anyone's professional experience," Ellsworth said from the window. She was looking at Harry with a directness she hadn't had before. "In recorded history, I would say." "That's comforting," Ron said. "I mean it as a compliment," Ellsworth said, which was the first thing she'd said that had any human warmth in it, and Harry looked at her and she looked back, and she said, "I owe you an apology, Mr. Potter. The word I used yesterday was detained. I knew what word I was choosing. I chose it because I was frightened of the findings and I let that govern my professional judgment. She unfolded her arms. I was wrong. Harry studied her. Have you treated patients before whose results you flagged under Protocol 7? She was quiet for a moment. Twice. One was a genuine case of dark curse contamination. The other was a Muggle-born child whose natural magic registered as anomalous because our database doesn't have adequate records for the expression patterns common in first-generation magical children. She paused. That child was detained. For 2 days. Before anyone thought to simply look at the family background. Did you flag the protocol issue then? I wrote a note in the file. A note in the file, Harry said. Ellsworth looked at her hands. Yes. Right, Harry said. He looked at Pi. The formal review of Protocol 7. You said you intend to submit one. Yes. I want the Muggle-born case included. The child Dr. Ellsworth mentioned. I want the full pattern of false flags going back, however far back your records go. I want someone looking at whether this protocol has been catching the wrong people systematically. He looked at Croft, who had said nothing during the entire diagnostic. And you? The man with the blunt vocabulary. What do you think? Croft looked mildly surprised at being addressed. He was, Harry thought, probably in his 50s, built like someone who had done physical work before medicine, with hands too large for a pen and a face that was more honest than it was kind. I think, Croft said, that I applied a template that didn't fit the case. I've seen dark magic sourced in a patient before. I assumed this was the same and it isn't. He looked at Harry with the directness of someone who thought carefully before speaking and then said exactly what they meant. I also think you're the most extraordinary person I've ever had in one of these rooms, and I've been in this department for 22 years. Extraordinary how? Harry asked. You came in here to be examined, Croft said. Voluntarily. After we tried to have you arrested. You lay down on that bed and you watched every instrument and you asked good questions and you didn't hide a single thing. He paused. Most people, finding out what you just found out, a piece of the darkest wizard of the century in their skull, a bloodline that doesn't exist in the records, most people would be on the floor. I knew something was in my scar, Harry said. I've known since I was 11, more or less, that something was wrong with it. It hurt during Voldemort's moments. It showed me things. He looked at the scar on his forehead, which he couldn't see but knew was there from 11 years of it being the first thing anyone looked at when they met him. Knowing what it is, that's not worse than not knowing. That's better. He paused. The Merlin thing is new, but, he stopped. But it didn't feel new. That was the thing he wasn't saying. When Dumbledore had said the name in the quiet of this room, something in Harry had done the opposite of being surprised. Something had felt, in the most bone-deep and private way, like recognition. He decided not to say that. Not yet. Not with 5 people and Dumbledore in the room. What happens next? He asked Pi. The Ministry will want the full diagnostic results, Pi said. They'll want to assign, they'll want ongoing monitoring. Regular panels. I'm willing to consent to quarterly panels, Harry said. At St Mungo's, with results shared with my guardians and Dumbledore. With full access for myself. He looked at Arthur. Does that work with the legal structure? Arthur was looking at him with an expression that Harry had never quite seen on Arthur Weasley's face before, a kind of steady, deeply moved respect that didn't have any condescension in it anywhere, not even the well-meaning kind. That works, Arthur said quietly. And the investigative hold order from this morning? Harry looked at Pi. I'll recommend it be lifted. You've cooperated fully. The investigation has what it needs. Pi paused. I'd like to continue studying the results, with your permission. Not for the Ministry. 4. There's very little literature on any of this. If you'd be willing to, I'd like to understand what I'm looking at. Harry thought about this. Send me whatever you write, he said. Before you publish it anywhere. I read it first. Pi nodded immediately. Of course. And no names without consent. No names. Then yes, Harry said. I'm willing. Pi looked at the table, and then at Harry, and there was something in his precise young face that was more complicated than professional satisfaction, something that looked, honestly, like relief. The particular relief of someone who has done something wrong, tried to make it right, and been given the chance to do better. Harry understood that feeling. Can we have the room? Harry said. Just myself and Professor Dumbledore. Arthur looked at him. Harry, I'll be 10 minutes, Harry said. Maybe 15. Arthur looked at Dumbledore, who gave a small nod of, not reassurance, exactly. Acknowledgement. Arthur pushed back from the table and stood, and the healers followed, and Ron lingered until Harry looked at him, and he left too, casting a look over his shoulder that said clearly, I will be directly outside that door and I am not leaving the corridor. The door clicked shut. The room was quiet. Afternoon light through the London-facing windows. The diagnostic instruments dormant. The charm matrix resting again, horizontal, pointed at nothing. Harry looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore looked back. The person you saw, Harry said. With the broadcasting marker. Was it you? A pause. Long enough to be its own kind of answer. Yes, Dumbledore said. When you were young. When I was very young. The marker faded as I aged. As I learned to conform my magic to the standard expression patterns, as most magical people unconsciously do. He paused. I believe you haven't done that. Conformed. The experiences of your early childhood, the suppression, the Dursleys, he stopped. There are some things that wound and some things that, paradoxically, preserve. I believe the way you were raised prevented the natural conforming process from happening. Your magic has never been taught to be small. Harry sat with this for a moment. You're saying the Dursleys accidentally kept me more powerful. I'm saying they couldn't teach you to hide what you were because they couldn't see it. Yes. And you knew that. Dumbledore looked at the table. I considered it. And you still placed me there. The blood protection was real, Dumbledore said. It was genuine. And yes, I considered the other implications. I did not always make choices that were only about your well-being, Harry. I made choices that were about the war. About the larger outcome. He looked up. I intend to be honest with you about that now. You're right that you should have been told. You're right that the decisions were not mine alone to make. I had reasons, and I believe many of my reasons were sound, and I also know that none of that means I was right. Harry looked at him. At the old man with his extraordinary face and his terrible knowledge and his genuine love that somehow kept colliding with his genuine paternalism, and it was the collision that was the problem, not either thing individually. The Horcrux in my scar, Harry said. Can it be removed? Dumbledore was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to say several things without saying them. That, he said, is the question I've been afraid of you asking. Because the answer is complicated. Because the answer is yes, Dumbledore said. But the method involves dying, Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him sharply. That was the thing you were afraid to tell me, Harry said. That the Horcrux can be removed but the process to do it requires, he stopped. Thought. Or does it? Is that what the theory says, or is that the assumption? Pi's chart was on the table between them. Harry reached across and turned it to face him, found the soul resonance row again, read Pi's margin note. Unlike standard Horcrux theory, the embedding is in scar tissue, not an object. Subject is living. Integration incomplete, suggests the fragment was not intentionally placed but arrived as a consequence of the spell's failure. He tapped the note. Pi thinks it wasn't intentionally placed, he said. He thinks it happened because Voldemort's killing curse rebounded and something spilled over. Like a transfer that happened by accident. Yes, Dumbledore said quietly. Which means the theoretical framework about destruction of the host being required, that's for intentional Horcruxes. Objects. Things he made deliberately. Yes, Dumbledore said again, and his voice had something in it that Harry recognized slowly as hope, not the big dramatic kind, but the kind that sits very still and is afraid of being seen. So there might be another way, Harry said. I believe so, Dumbledore said. I have been researching it for 3 years. I have a partial theory. It requires, he stopped. It requires time. And the right knowledge. And a level of magical precision that, he looked at Harry. That may, in light of today's diagnostic, be more accessible than I had assumed. The bloodline, Harry said. The bloodline, Dumbledore confirmed. Harry sat back. He looked at the water stain on the ceiling, the handprint shape, and then he looked at the charm matrix tilted slightly on its frame even now, in the dormant room, because whatever it was tracking was still there. Still present. Still broadcasting. You should have told me all of this, he said. Years ago. Yes. We've wasted time. Yes, Dumbledore said, and something in him seemed to settle, like a man who has stopped carrying something and put it down. I'm sorry, Harry. Harry looked at him for a moment. The apology was real. He could see that. Could feel it. The thing about Dumbledore, the genuinely maddening, complicated, impossible thing, was that he was sorry and he meant it and he had still made the choices he'd made, and both of those things were true simultaneously, and Harry was going to have to figure out what to do with that. Not today. Okay, Harry said. Here's what happens now. You share your research with me, all of it, the Horcrux theory, the bloodline material, everything. I'm a person in this situation, not a piece of it. We work on the solution together. Harry, some of this material is, I'm not asking, Harry said. Not unkindly. Just clearly. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. And then he smiled, the real smile, not the twinkly performed one, but the rare and smaller one that lived deeper in his face. No, he said. I can see that you aren't. Good. Harry stood. Then let's go get the others. He crossed to the door and opened it. Ron was precisely where he'd said he'd be, directly in the corridor, arms folded, watching the door, and behind him, Arthur, and beyond them Pi with his notebook, all of them arranged in the hallway in the slightly awkward cluster of people who have been trying and failing to look like they weren't listening. Everything all right? Ron asked, reading Harry's face. Getting there, Harry said. Do you want to go home? Harry thought about the burrow. The kitchen. The gnomes, the clock, the smell of toast. Molly at the table with her hands folded waiting for the conversation she deserved to have. Yeah, he said. Let's go home. They were almost at the lobby when Pi called after them, and Harry turned. The healer was standing in the corridor with his notebook against his chest and his precise face holding something he hadn't shown before, the look of someone about to say a thing they're not sure how it'll land. The broadcasting marker, he said. The charm matrix. The thing it was doing. He paused. I want to be clear about what I said earlier. I said I didn't know what the signal was. He stopped again. That's not entirely true. I said it because I wanted to verify it before. He looked at Harry. The frequency it's broadcasting on. I know what frequency that is. I've seen it in one other context, in the literature. What context? Harry said. Warding, Pi said. The oldest form of warding magic. Territorial. Environmental. The kind the founders used when they built Hogwarts. He paused. Your magic is always, the signal it's putting out is the same frequency as the protective enchantments on ancient structures. The ones that aren't cast, that just exist because the person who made them existed. He looked at Harry steadily. You don't put up protective wards, Mr. Potter. You are one. The lobby was warm and busy and indifferent around them. Harry looked at Pi. Huh, he said. Yeah, said Pi. Ron said, very softly, Merlin's beard. And for the first time all day, Harry laughed, a real one, short and surprised and startled out of him by the sheer improbability of his own life, and the laugh echoed off the hospital lobby's high ceiling and a passing healer looked up and a child in a waiting chair pointed, and Harry stood in the middle of his tea. Mungo's at 3:45 in the afternoon with the knowledge of what he was sitting in his chest like something finally named, and he was laughing. Arthur put a hand on his shoulder. Dumbledore looked at him with that small, real smile. Ron grinned the enormous, helpless grin of someone delighted for his best friend even in the middle of something enormous. Right, Harry said, when the laugh had run its course. Let's go. He walked out through the lobby. The enchanted sign above the door cycled through its categories: creature injuries, artifact accidents, potions poisoning, spell damage, magical bugs. Harry passed under it without looking up. He already knew which category he was. None of them. Chapter 4, What the Old Man Kept. The Burrow was quiet when they got back, which meant nothing good. Quiet at the Burrow was unusual the way snow in July was unusual, technically possible, but always a sign that something had disrupted the natural order. Normally the house produced noise the way it produced warmth, automatically, as a function of existing. Now the kitchen was still when Harry came through the back door, the dishes not moving in their sudsy orbit, the clock hands all pointing at home with the quality of something holding its breath. Molly was at the table. She'd been sitting there for a while, Harry thought. Long enough that her tea had gone cold and she hadn't bothered to reheat it. Long enough that she'd found a dishcloth to fold and refold without purpose, the way hands needed something to do when the mind was somewhere else entirely. She looked up when Harry came in. Arthur came in behind him and went directly to her and put his hand on her shoulder, and she covered it with hers without looking away from Harry. Ron stopped in the doorway to the hall, reading the room with the accuracy of someone who'd grown up in it. Dumbledore came last and stood slightly back, near the kitchen wall, in the manner of someone who understood they were background to this particular scene. How did it go? Molly asked. Well, Harry said. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. Not at the far end. Directly across, close enough that this was clearly a conversation and not an announcement. We got a lot of answers. Good answers? Complicated answers. He paused. Better than the alternative. She looked at the dishcloth in her hands. Harry, let me go first, he said. Not harshly. Just clearly. Please. She stopped. Nodded. He'd been thinking about this on the night bus back, sitting beside Ron and watching London's muggle streets rearrange themselves around the bus's aggressive path through traffic, the passengers at the front cheerfully ignoring everything. He'd been thinking about what he wanted to say and how he wanted to say it, and he'd gotten about halfway through a sentence in his head and realized he was overthinking it, which was not a trap he usually fell into. So he just said it. You took something of mine, he said. Without asking. You decided I couldn't be trusted with whatever you found out, or you were afraid of what I'd say if you asked, or both. And then when the healers told you something was wrong, you came home and didn't tell me that either, because someone told you not to, and you listened to them instead of me. He looked at her. And I understand why you did all of it. I understand that you were frightened and you love me and you thought knowing would help. I believe all of that. I believe you completely. He paused. It was still wrong. Molly's jaw tightened. Not in anger, in the specific way jaws tighten when someone is keeping themselves together. I know, she said. I need you to understand why it was wrong though. Not just that it was. Harry put his hands flat on the table. I've had people making decisions about my body and my future since before I can remember. My whole life, people have looked at me and decided what I could handle and what I needed to be protected from and what the right thing for me was, without actually asking. Dumbledore did it. He's sitting in your kitchen right now knowing he did it. The healers at St Mungo's did it. The ministry did it this morning. He looked at her steadily. You did it too. And I need you to understand that it's not okay, coming from anyone. Not even from you. Especially not from you. Especially, she repeated, very quietly. Because you matter more, he said. Because this house and your family, you're the closest thing I have to a family that chose me. Which means when you treat me like something to be managed, it lands differently than when the ministry does it. It costs more. He paused. Do you understand what I'm saying? Molly looked at him for a long moment. There were tears in her eyes, not falling, held back with the same effort that was keeping her jaw set. Yes, she said. I understand exactly what you're saying. Okay, Harry said. Are you? She stopped. Tried again. Can you forgive me? Eventually? I'm not asking for now. I'm asking if it's possible. Harry looked at her hands on the table, the dishcloth, the chapped knuckles, the ring she'd worn since before Bill was born. He thought about the green jumper he was wearing. He thought about Midnight Chicken and the clock with 9 hands. Yeah, he said. It's possible. She did cry then, briefly, and she pressed the dishcloth against her eyes and Arthur squeezed her shoulder and Ron, in the doorway, looked at the ceiling in the way people look at ceilings when they're pretending they're not moved. Harry gave it a moment. Then he said, there's more. About the diagnostic. About what they found. Molly lowered the dishcloth. Tell me. He told them everything. All 4 of them, Molly and Arthur at the table, Ron in his chair at the corner, Dumbledore still standing by the wall, and he went through it in order, the way he'd processed it in the hospital room, which was the same way he processed everything, one piece at a time, starting with the most manageable and building to the most enormous. The Parseltongue marker first. Structural, ancient, foundational. Not a curse. Just something that had been there since before he could speak. Molly listened to this with her hands wrapped around her cold tea and her face doing its careful, practiced control. The soul resonance next. He said the word Horcrux and watched the word land differently for different people, Arthur's face going a specific gray, Molly going very still, Ron saying quietly I've read about those in the voice of someone who wished he hadn't. He explained it precisely the way Pi had explained it, an accidental embedding, the night of the attack, Voldemort's curse rebounding and spilling something into the wound. Then the bloodline. Ron, who had already heard this and had been holding it in with visible effort since the hospital lobby, made a sound. Ron, Harry said. Merlin, Ron said. I'm not, I know I already knew, it doesn't get less, Ron. Sorry. Go ahead. Molly looked between them. What about Merlin? The pre-classification bloodline, Harry said. That's what Dumbledore's theory says. The inheritance markers in my blood, they correspond to Merlin's family line. Emery's. He paused. Distant. Very distant. But active. Molly stared at him. Merlin, Arthur said. That's what he said. Arthur looked at Dumbledore, who inclined his head slightly. How long have you known that? Arthur asked him. I've had the theory for approximately 12 years, Dumbledore said. The confirmation, that came today, from Healer Pi's diagnostic. 12 years, Arthur said, and there it was again, that quiet that was more pointed than shouting. Arthur Weasley was generally the warmest, most enthusiastic man Harry knew, and his versions of anger were so rare and so measured that they cut deeper than anyone else's fury. You've had a theory that Harry carries one of the most significant bloodlines in the history of British magic for 12 years and you said nothing. I had no proof, Dumbledore said. Only indicators. You had enough to know it mattered. Arthur, Dumbledore said, and his voice was very gentle, you are right. I said so to Harry in the hospital room. I'm not going to produce a different defense for this audience. He looked at Harry. I made choices based on what I thought the war required. I have told Harry that those choices were not mine alone to make, and I stand by that admission. I have no other defense to offer because I don't believe I have one. The kitchen was quiet again. The Horcrux, Molly said, pulling the conversation back to its center with the practical instinct of someone who had spent 30 years as the eye of a perpetual storm. Can it be removed? Yes, Harry said. Probably. Dumbledore has a theory, a partial one. He's been working on it for 3 years. He looked at Dumbledore. We're going to work on it together now. Something shifted in Arthur's face, the gray easing slightly, replaced by something that was still worried but differently worried. Molly looked at Dumbledore and then at Harry. What does that involve? We don't know yet, Harry said honestly. That's the honest answer. Dumbledore has research and I have. He paused. Apparently I have a bloodline that might make the approach more viable than it would have been otherwise. So we work with what we have. Is it dangerous? Molly asked. Yes, Harry said. Because lying would insult all 3 of them and he was done with the comfortable versions of things. Molly nodded once, a single controlled motion. Okay, she said. Okay? Ron said. Mom, he just said, I heard what he said, Ronald. She looked at Harry. He's not going to be managed. He's made that extremely clear and he's right, and so, okay. You'll work on it with Dumbledore, and you'll tell me when you know more, and I will. She stopped. I'll make sure there's food. And I'll be here when you need something that isn't research. Harry looked at her. The specific steadiness she was holding herself to was the most difficult thing he'd watched her do, and he'd watched her face down a boggart shaped like her dead children. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me. She was almost smiling. It was a complicated smile, the kind that had grief and love and guilt and relief all in it at once. I said that yesterday, didn't I? You did. I meant it then too. Just for different reasons. Dinner that evening was full-volume Burrow noise, which Harry suspected was at least partially a deliberate effort by the family to return the house to its natural state by sheer force of personality. Fred and George had discovered enough of what had happened, through Ron, and through the specific Weasley household osmosis that meant nothing stayed private for very long, and their response was to be, theatrically and determinately, exactly themselves. The thing is, Fred said, passing the potatoes, it explains quite a lot. It really does, George agreed. The whole surviving everything thing. Historically anomalous levels of survival. We always said he was secretly more impressive than he looked. You've never said that, Ron told them. We say it internally, Fred said. Very loud internal voice, George said. The loudest. Harry ate his potatoes and let this wash over him, which was what Fred and George were good for, the exact specific quality of absurdity that made enormous things feel survivable. He was genuinely grateful for it in a way he couldn't have articulated. Ginny, to his left, said nothing for most of dinner, which was its own kind of attention. She ate with the focused quiet of someone thinking very hard about something they weren't ready to say yet. Harry had noticed her doing this before, the controlled internal processing that she developed as the youngest of 7, the skill of thinking in loud rooms. Eventually, near the end of dinner, she said, the broadcasting thing. The frequency. Yeah, Harry said. That's why Hogwarts always felt different when you were there, she said. Specifically. She looked at her plate. The castle always felt more settled. More there. On the years you were in it versus the year you weren't. I thought it was just me. She looked up. It wasn't just me, was it? Harry thought about second year. The year he was physically present, but the castle had felt deeply, disturbingly wrong, and then he thought about what was wrong that year, the monster in the pipes, the fear, the memory of something dark in a diary, and he thought about whether the castle had felt that way because of the threat or because something in him was already responding to it. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But probably not just you." Ginny nodded and went back to her dinner, and Harry sat with the idea of that, of the castle responding to him, of the wards, of the ancient protective frequency that Pi had identified, and he filed it carefully, in the part of his mind where things went when they needed more time. Dumbledore stayed for dinner, which surprised Harry slightly and then didn't, because of course he stayed. There were things that needed to be begun, and Dumbledore, whatever his failures, was not a man who wasted time once he'd made up his mind. After dinner, while the family moved to the sitting room and Fred and George set up what appeared to be an extremely competitive round of exploding snap, Dumbledore caught Harry's eye across the kitchen, and Harry put down his dessert plate and followed him out the back door into the garden. The evening was warm and still, the gnomes asleep, the sky above Ottery St. Catchpole doing the slow, unhurried business of going from gold to purple to dark. Dumbledore conjured 2 chairs, comfortable ones, which Harry noted with private amusement was a choice that said something about the old man's approach to difficult conversations, and they sat in the garden with the kitchen light warm through the window behind them. "The research," Harry said. "Yes." Dumbledore reached into his robes and produced something Harry hadn't expected, a journal. Leather-bound, worn at the corners, handwritten in a close neat hand. He held it for a moment. "I want to be honest with you about the state of my thinking," he said. "I will show you everything. But I want to preface it by saying that 3 years of work has brought me to a partial theory, not a solution. There are elements I haven't been able to crack." "What elements?" "The removal mechanism." Dumbledore turned the journal in his hands. I'm nearly certain, that the Horcrux fragment in your scar is removable without destroying the host. Because, as Pi correctly identified, it was not placed deliberately. It arrived as a consequence of failed dark magic, which means it's not anchored the way a deliberately created Horcrux is anchored. It sits in the scar tissue the way a splinter sits in a finger, rather than the way a root sits in the ground. So it can be extracted rather than destroyed, Harry said. In theory. Yes. Dumbledore opened the journal. The extraction, though. The method. He found a page and turned it toward Harry. The handwriting here was more agitated than the rest, denser, with crossings out and margin notes. Every extraction method I've theorized requires an external catalyst. Something that can reach the fragment at the same magical frequency as the embedding. Harry looked at the page. Read the notation. The same frequency as the embedding means, Voldemort's frequency, Dumbledore said. Which is to say, Parseltongue encoded magic. He looked at Harry over his glasses. Which is to say, me, Harry said. You, Dumbledore said. The irony of it is, I believe you may be the only person who can perform the extraction. Because you're the only person in current living memory who carries Parseltongue magic at the structural level. Anyone else attempting it would be working in a foreign language, effectively. Harry looked at the garden. A gnome had woken up somewhere in the vegetable patch and was making small disgruntled noises, apparently arguing with a potato. He watched it for a moment. So I have to remove it myself, he said. That is my current belief. With guidance, with preparation, Dumbledore paused. Harry, I want to be careful about how I explain the rest of this. Don't, Harry said. Dumbledore blinked. Don't be careful, Harry said. Say it straight. That's the whole point of tonight, isn't it? We said it in the hospital room. No more managing. Dumbledore sat with this for a moment. Then he said, the process of extraction, as I currently theorize it, requires you to enter a state of directed inward focus. Something like deep meditation, but with active magical intent. You will need to locate the fragment, to perceive it in whatever way your magic perceives things, and you will need to separate it from yourself deliberately. Not destroy it. Pull it clear. He paused. The difficulty is that the fragment is not passive. It's a piece of Voldemort's consciousness. When it becomes aware of being threatened, it will resist. It'll fight back, Harry said. In a manner of speaking, yes. From the inside. Harry thought about the times his scar had been worst: second year, when the diary had been at full power. Third year, Dementor proximity. Fourth year, the graveyard. The pain that was different from any other pain, the feeling of something pressing from inside his skull. He thought about what that would feel like if it was deliberate. If he went toward it instead of away. "When do we start?" he said. Dumbledore looked at him. "You understand this will take time. Weeks at minimum." "It requires, I know it'll take time," Harry said. "I'm asking when we start." A pause. "Next week," Dumbledore said. "I need 3 days to prepare some materials. I'll come back Thursday." "All right," Harry said. Thursday. Dumbledore looked at him in the garden light, the journal still open on his knee, and his expression was the one Harry had only seen a few times, the one that wasn't performing anything, wasn't managing anything, was just the old man looking at a boy he cared about with the weight of everything he'd gotten wrong between them. "I should have done this years ago," Dumbledore said. "Yes," Harry said. Not to be harsh. Just because it was true and they'd both agreed to stop softening true things. "I was afraid," Dumbledore said. Something about the way he said it made Harry look at him sharply, because Dumbledore saying the word afraid without irony or deflection was startling. "Not for you. For myself." He paused. "I have made grave errors in my life, Harry. More than you know. I lost someone once, because I was certain I knew what was right and I didn't leave room for anyone else to know differently." He looked at the garden. "I became afraid of my own judgment in personal matters. I overcorrected. I became professionally distant, where distance wasn't warranted." Harry looked at the old man in the garden chair and thought about how strange it was, that the people who had the most power were often the ones most damaged by it. How the higher you got, the harder it was to see what was right in front of you. "You've got room now to know differently," Harry said. "If you want it." Dumbledore looked at him. "I do want it." "Thursday, then," Harry said. He stood, because he was cold and the gnome in the vegetable patch had escalated to what sounded like a full argument with the entire potato row, and because he thought they'd said the necessary things and the rest could wait for Thursday when there was actual work to do. Dumbledore stood too. He closed the journal and tucked it away, and he looked like he was going to say something else, and then he didn't, which was, Harry thought, probably growth. They went back inside. He found Hermione in his room. This was not unexpected in the abstract. She'd been in the Burrow for a day already, having arrived by flush shortly after Harry and the others had left for the hospital, which Ron had mentioned in passing and which Harry had filed under things to deal with in order. But he hadn't actually thought through the part where she'd be in his room when he came up, sitting cross-legged on his bed with 3 books open around her and a piece of parchment covered so densely in her handwriting that it had begun to curl at the edges. She looked up when he came in. "Sit down," she said. "It's my room," he said. "Sit down," she said again, in the voice that had been routing Harry and Ron toward correct decisions since first year. He sat on the edge of the bed. Ron came in behind him and sat on his own bed without being told, because Ron knew that voice too. "I've been researching since Ron told me last night," Hermione said. "Before the diagnostic, before this morning, before all of it. He told me there was a ministry scroll and healers demanding arrest and I started looking things up immediately because that's what I do and I need you to know what I've found." "Okay," Harry said. "3 things," she said, picking up the parchment. "First, Protocol 7, Paragraph 12, at St Mungo's. I found the original legislative text. It was written in 1947, amended in 1962, and in its current form it has been applied 17 times in the last 30 years. She looked up. 11 of those applications involved Muggle-born or half-blood patients. 13 of them were ultimately found to be false flags, meaning the patient wasn't a source of dark magic, they were a victim of it or simply had unusual magical markers. Of the remaining 4 genuine applications, 3 were managed with treatment, not arrest. She put the parchment down. One ended in the patient being held in Azkaban for 6 months before the error was discovered. Harry said nothing for a moment. Do you know who the patient was? A woman named Doris Crockford, Hermione said quietly. She's mentioned in passing in a few places. She was Muggle-born. Her magic expressed unusually high in diagnostic testing and it triggered the protocol. She paused. She spent 6 months in Azkaban for having strong magic. The room was very quiet. That's what would have happened, Ron said, and he wasn't looking at Harry, he was looking at the window, if you'd let them arrest you. I wasn't going to let them arrest me, Harry said. I know. But if you hadn't, if it had been someone else. Someone who didn't know, who was frightened, Ron stopped. That's the second thing, Hermione said, and her voice was level because she was keeping it level deliberately. The pattern. The 11 Muggle-born applications out of 17 total. That's not random. That's a bias in the protocol, either in the diagnostic parameters, which may be calibrated to flag unusual magical markers that are more common in first-generation magical people, or in the reporting behavior of the healers running the panels, or both. She looked at her parchment. I think Pi needs to know this. If he's submitting a formal review, these numbers need to be part of it. He'll get them, Harry said. I told him I wanted the full pattern included. Hermione looked at him with the expression of someone who wanted to ask how the hospital had gone and was making herself stick to her list. Third, she said. And this is the one I'm least certain about, but I think it matters. She picked up one of the open books, a large, old one, the kind that smelled of other libraries. Merlin's Descendants. Harry looked at her. Ron told me, she said. In the second owl. I've been in Mr. and Mrs. Weasley's library since 6 o'clock. She turned the book to show him the page. It was a genealogical text, the kind that academic libraries kept in reference rooms, densely illustrated with family trees. There is actually scholarship on the Emery's line. Not popular scholarship. Very obscure. But it exists. She found the page she wanted. The line was thought to have died out in the 14th century. But there was a branch, a younger son of the last recorded Emery's heir, who emigrated from Wales in the 1280s and vanished from the records. She looked up. He wasn't in Britain anymore. He was in, the records are partial, but the scholarship suggests he went to what is now France. And then later, possibly Italy. She paused. And the Potter family name appears in British records for the first time in the mid-16th century. Ron sat up straight. Hermione. I know. I know, Ron. That's only 250 years, Hermione said. Yes. Which is consistent with 3 to 5 generations of dispersal and re-immigration, if the line had indeed been traveling that whole time. She looked at Harry. I can't prove it. The records aren't complete enough. But the timeline works, and the bloodline markers, she put the book down. The markers that Pi found in your blood. I looked up the description. They matched the markers described in this text as characteristic of the Emery's line. She said it very simply, as a series of established facts connected by evidence. Harry. You're not just distantly descended. If this scholarship is correct, you might be the last. Harry stared at her. The last, he said. The last in the direct patrilineal line, she said. There may be others through collateral branches, but the direct line, if the Potter family carried it forward, and you're the last Potter, she stopped. Oh, Ron said, and he said it with the tone of someone to whom a very large number of things had just simultaneously become clear. Harry sat on the edge of the bed in the orange room and looked at the genealogical text and thought about his father. About a man he knew mostly through photographs and other people's memories, a man who'd been told was clever, was brave, was good, was loved. He thought about the name he carried. He thought about what Pi had said in the lobby, about the broadcasting signal, about being a ward rather than casting one. The last, he said again. That we know of, Hermione said carefully. But yes. He picked up the book. Read the page himself. The scholarship was careful and hedged in the right places and confident in the right other places, and it was, he thought, very probably correct in its core conclusion. He could feel it the same way he'd felt recognition when Dumbledore said the name in the hospital room, not surprise but placement. Like finding the name for something that had always been there. Right, he said. Right? Ron said. It is what it is, Harry said. It doesn't change the plan. Harry, you're the last heir of Merlin, Ron. Harry looked at him. What does that actually change about what I need to do tomorrow? Or Thursday, when Dumbledore comes back? Ron opened his mouth. Closed it. Nothing, he admitted. Exactly. Harry set the book down. It changes the why of some things. Not the what. He looked at Hermione. Good research. This goes with Dumbledore's journal material. Can you write up a summary? Hermione already had a fresh piece of parchment on her knee. Ahead of you, she said. Of course you are. He leaned back on the headboard. The review of Protocol 7. Pi said he'd be in contact. I want you in that conversation, if you're willing. Hermione looked at him with an expression of such absolute certainty that it almost didn't need saying. Obviously, she said. Good. He looked at the ceiling. And I need you to write to your parents. She blinked. What? Your parents. Tell them what you found about the Muggle-born diagnostic flagging. Not the whole story, just that piece. You don't have to tell them about me specifically. He paused. But they should know. They're Muggle. If they ever had to come into contact with the wizarding medical system for some reason, they should know that the protocol has been used badly and that someone is trying to fix it. Hermione was very quiet for a moment. Yes. You're right. She made a note on her parchment. Okay, Harry said. That's where we are. That's where we are, she agreed. She picked up her books and her parchment and her organized avalanche of notes and stood, and at the door she turned back. Harry, she said. How are you? Actually. The question landed differently from Hermione than it did from most people, because Hermione asked it with the specific investment of someone who wanted the real answer and had the capacity to do something useful with it. Harry thought about the day. The scroll at 6 a.m. The Aurors at the door. The hospital room with the charm matrix tilting. Pi's note in the margin, foundational, as if the magic itself has been rewritten. Dumbledore in the garden, the journal on his knee, saying I was afraid with the plain honesty of something finally put down. The last Potter. The last of the Emery's line. A piece of Voldemort in his head and a bloodline that predated the Ministry and a signal his magic was always sending that said I am here, and nothing here will be harmed. I'm alright, he said. And he meant it differently than he had all the other times he'd said it. Not as reassurance. As a fact. Actually alright. Hermione looked at him for a moment. Good, she said, and left. Ron sat across the room in his pajamas because he'd apparently changed at some point during Hermione's briefing, and he was looking at Harry with the same expression he'd had at breakfast, the question he'd asked then about when Harry had stopped being reactive, stopped being afraid. She loves you, you know, Ron said. My mum. Genuinely. Like one of ours. I know, Harry said. She was still wrong. I know that too. And you handled it. Ron searched for the word. You handled it like someone who already decided he wasn't going to be made smaller by it. He paused. When did that happen? Was it today? Harry thought about the kitchen at 6 in the morning. Reading the ministry scroll on his own. Making tea before anyone else woke up. Writing 3 letters. Eating breakfast. I think, he said slowly, it's been happening for a while. It just needed something big enough to make it obvious. Ron nodded slowly. Well, he said, reaching over and turning off the lamp by his bed, for what it's worth. It's about time. The room went dark except for the orange glow of the Chudley Cannons poster that had some mild luminescence charm on it that Ron had put on in 3rd year and never taken off. Ron, Harry said. Yeah. Merlin's beard. Ron laughed in the dark, a real one, helpless and warm. Merlin's beard, he agreed. Outside the window the Ottery St. Catchpole sky was enormous and clear, more stars than clouds, the kind of summer night sky that looked like something that wanted to be looked at. Harry lay on his back in the orange light and listened to Ron's breathing go slow and even and looked at the ceiling and thought about Thursday. About the piece of something dark that had lived in his head for 13 years and was about to be invited to leave. About an old man with a garden chair and a worn journal who had finally, perhaps genuinely finally, stopped managing things. About his father's name. About a boy who'd left Wales in the 1280s and gone looking for something and apparently found it, and passed it down through the centuries to here, to this orange room, to this particular summer night. He closed his eyes. For the first time in a long time, sleep came without the waiting. Chapter 5, Amelia Bones makes a choice. The reply from Amelia Bones arrived on Wednesday morning, 2 days after Harry had sent the owl, carried not by a ministry bird but by a small, fast falcon that landed on the garden wall with the precision of something that knew exactly where it was going and had opinions about being made to wait. Harry was in the garden with a cup of tea when it arrived. He'd taken to having his morning tea outside. The garden was quiet before the rest of the house woke up, just the gnomes in their early morning stupor and the sound of the countryside doing its unhurried business, and he found he needed the quiet more than he'd previously admitted to himself. It was the kind of need that had always been there but had been drowned out by other more urgent needs, and now that some of the urgent ones had been named and put somewhere manageable, the quieter ones were surfacing. He untied the letter from the falcon's leg. The falcon looked at him with the direct, unimpressed assessment of a bird that worked for someone who expected things done properly, then accepted the piece of crust he offered and left. The letter was short. Mr. Potter, your letter was both the most unusual and the most sensible correspondence I have received from a minor in 20 years of public service. I've already read the St. Mungo's diagnostic request and the DMLE owl log from Monday morning. I have questions. I believe you have answers. I would like to meet, not at the ministry, not at the hospital. Somewhere neutral. Tomorrow afternoon, if you're available. I'm told you like the leaky cauldron. I don't, particularly, but I can manage it for an hour. A. Bones, Head, DMLEPS. I've pulled the full Protocol 7 application history going back to 1965. You were right that something is wrong with the numbers. We'll discuss. Harry read it twice. Then he drank his tea and watched the gnomes wake up and thought about Amelia Bones, who had read a letter from a 14-year-old and pulled the full application history of a hospital protocol within 48 hours. He went inside and told Hermione. She read the letter standing in the kitchen doorway with her hair still unbrushed and a piece of toast in one hand, and when she finished she looked up with an expression that was very close to the one she wore when a book gave her exactly the information she needed at exactly the right moment. She pulled the history herself, Hermione said. Yeah. She didn't delegate it. Apparently not. That means she's not managing this through the department. She's running it personally. Hermione bit her toast thoughtfully. Which means she doesn't trust her own department not to bury it. Harry hadn't quite gotten that far and now felt the satisfaction of arriving at the same destination 2 seconds after someone else. "Right," he said. "Which tells us something about the department." "It tells us a lot about the department," Hermione said. She handed him back the letter. "I want to come." "I know you do. I have the research." "I know. And the numbers from the Hermione," Harry said. "Yes. You're coming." She went upstairs to get dressed with the efficient urgency of someone who had already been planning to come and was now merely operating on confirmed information. Ron appeared from the kitchen table where he'd been pretending to read the Quid-Week supplement. "I'm coming too." "I know," Harry said. "Good," Ron said, and went back to the paper with the satisfied air of someone who had handled a negotiation. The leaky cauldron on a Thursday lunchtime was exactly what it always was, dark and warm and smelling of butterbeer and roasting meat, the tables occupied by the usual mixture of wizards who had business in Diagon Alley and wizards who had no business anywhere in particular but found the leaky cauldron an acceptable place to have no business in. Tom behind the bar was moving with his customary unhurried efficiency, and the general noise level was the particular, comfortable frequency of a place full of people who weren't paying much attention to each other. Amelia Bones was already there when Harry arrived with Ron and Hermione, which told him she'd come early, which told him she'd wanted to be there first, which told him she approached meetings the way she probably approached everything else, on her own terms, with her own timing. She was easier to recognize than he'd expected. Late 50s, solidly built, with the kind of upright posture that came from genuine confidence rather than performance. Her robes were good quality but plain, a dark navy, no jewelry except a single ring on her right hand. Her hair was silver gray and cut close to her head, and her face was sharp in the specific way of someone who had been paying careful attention for a very long time and had gotten very good at it. She had a glass of water in front of her, not butterbeer. She looked at Harry when he came through the door with a directness that he found immediately comfortable. It wasn't the double-take look, the automatic scanning for the scar, the lightning bolt check, it was the look of someone assessing a person, not an icon. "Mr. Potter," she said. "Ms. Bones," Harry said, and pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and Ron and Hermione took the chairs to either side of him with the practiced coordination of people who had been doing this kind of thing for 4 years. Bones looked at the three of them. "You brought your friends," she said. "Hermione has the research," Harry said. "Ron is moral support." "I'm also tactical backup," Ron said. Bones looked at Ron for a moment. "Tactical backup," she repeated. "He means he's here in case it goes wrong," Hermione said helpfully. "What would going wrong look like?" Bones asked, with the tone of someone genuinely curious. "I don't know," Ron said. "Something usually does." Bones looked at him for another moment and then made a sound that was probably a laugh, or the skeleton of one, and picked up her water. "All right," she said. "Let's begin." Tom came for orders, butterbeers for Ron and Harry, tea for Hermione, nothing more for Bones, and then they were alone in the relative privacy of the corner table that Bones had selected, far enough from the bar noise to talk properly. "Before I ask my questions," Bones said, "I want to tell you what I already know, so we're not wasting each other's time." She folded her hands on the table in a way that reminded Harry, uncomfortably, of Molly. Though the similarity ended there. "I know about the diagnostic. I've read Pye's initial report and his supplementary notes from Tuesday's examination. I know what the panel showed." She looked at Harry. "I've also spoken with Arthur Weasley, who told me the morning's events from his perspective, and I've pulled the original DMLE authorization for the investigative hold." "What did the authorization tell you?" Harry asked. "That whoever signed off on it did so in 17 minutes, Bones said. "From the time Pye's owl arrived to the time the order was issued, 17 minutes. No review. No secondary sign-off." She paused. "The standard process for a Protocol 7 investigative hold authorization is 48 hours minimum, with mandatory review by 2 senior DMLE officials. She looked at her water. Someone bypassed that process. Someone at quite a senior level, because the bypass required their authorization code. Hermione was already writing. "Do you know who?" Harry asked. "I have a very strong suspicion," Bones said. "I'm not prepared to name it until I have documentation that will survive a Wizengamot challenge. That's what I'm working on." She looked at Harry steadily. "What I need from you is a formal account of Monday morning. What happened from the time you read the scroll to the time the Aurors left your house?" "Everything," Harry told her. He was precise about it, times, words, who said what, and she listened the way he imagined she listened to everything, with both eyes on his face and nothing written down because she didn't need to write it down, she was tracking it internally and filing it. When he finished, she said, "Torres." "The senior Auror," Harry said. "Yes." "How did she seem?" Harry thought about Torres. The controlled face, the measured voice, the tiny moment of recalibration when he'd corrected her about Dawlish. "Professional," he said. "Uncomfortable with the assignment but committed to doing it correctly. She was the one who said I had a right to know the diagnostic findings." Bones nodded. "Torres is good," she said. "I assigned her specifically because I'd already gotten wind of the order, one of my people flagged it as unusual, and I wanted someone with enough judgment to handle whatever she found." She paused. "She filed her own report this morning. It contradicts the original authorization in several places." "Contradicts how?" Hermione asked, pen still moving. "The authorization assumes a hostile subject requiring physical custody," Bones said. "Torres's report describes a cooperative subject who had clearly read the relevant documentation, prepared a reasoned response, and was conducting himself, her words, with more procedural understanding than most adult subjects in my 11 years on the job." She looked at Harry with something that was not quite amusement but was adjacent to it. "You quoted the investigative hold statute at her." "I knew what it said," Harry said. "From a scroll you'd read once, an hour earlier." "I read quickly." Bones looked at him for a moment. "I've heard about you for 4 years," she said. "The boy who lived, Hogwarts champion, Triwizard disaster, various associated incidents. What I heard was a pattern of someone who ends up in dangerous situations." She paused. "What I'm sitting across from is something else." "What are you sitting across from?" Harry asked. "Someone who doesn't end up in situations," Bones said. "Someone who ends up in situations and then manages them." She picked up her water. "That's rarer. And considerably more useful." Harry held her gaze. "What do you actually want from this meeting, Ms. Bones?" She set the water down. "I want to shut down what happened Monday," she said. "Permanently. I want the person who bypassed the authorization process facing a Wizengamot inquiry. I want Protocol 7 reviewed and amended. And I want, if you're willing, your formal testimony about Monday morning as part of the documentation I'm building." She paused. "That's what I want from you." "And what do I get?" Harry asked, not because he was negotiating but because he wanted to understand what she thought this was. "You get a department that can't do this to you again," she said simply. "And you get whatever precedent this sets for everyone else the protocol has been used against incorrectly." She paused. "And you get me as someone who owes you a conversation, which in my experience is worth more than most things." Harry looked at her. Then he looked at Hermione, who gave him the smallest nod, the nod that meant she's right and the evidence backs her up. "All right," Harry said. "But I want something else." Bones waited. The full application history. Not just the numbers Hermione already has, the full case files, redacted for privacy where necessary, but with enough detail to identify the pattern properly. "Not for me. For the protocol review." He looked at her steadily. "And Pi needs to be part of that review." He identified the problem himself. He's already submitted a review request, and he should be in the room when it happens. Bones looked at him for a moment. "Pi," she said. "The healer who initiated the protocol application." "Yes. You want the man who tried to have you arrested to be part of the committee reviewing the protocol he used." "He made a mistake," Harry said. "He knows he made a mistake. He's already trying to fix it. That's exactly the kind of person who should be in the room, someone who's been inside the problem." He paused. "Having people who've never made the mistake trying to fix it is how you get a protocol that sounds better on paper but does the same thing in practice." Bones was quiet for a moment. Then she made the skeleton laugh sound again. "You're 14, she said, not as an insult, just as a statement of mild disbelief. "Yes," Harry said. "Right." She picked up her water. "Pi's in the room." "Fine." She looked at Hermione, who had filled 2 pieces of parchment and started on a third. "What's all that?" "Research," Hermione said, without looking up. "The statistical breakdown of Protocol 7 applications by blood status and result type going back to 1965. Would you like a copy?" Bones stared at her. "You compiled this, since Monday night," Hermione said. "I had access to the public portions of the legislative record. The gaps in the public data are themselves informative. There are 17 years between 1971 and 1988 where the application numbers jump significantly but the result records are missing. Which suggests either poor record keeping or deliberate omission." 1971 to 1988, Bones said. "That's the first rise of Voldemort and its immediate aftermath," Hermione said. "Yes. I thought that was significant." Bones looked at Hermione Granger with the expression of someone who has just found an unexpectedly sharp tool in a drawer they weren't expecting much from. "Miss Granger," she said. "Yes?" "When you finish Hogwarts, come and find me." Hermione looked up. Her face did something complicated, pride and caution and genuine surprise in quick succession. "I have several career options I'm considering," she said carefully. "Consider one more," Bones said. Harry drank his butterbeer and said nothing, because this seemed like a good moment to not say anything. They were there for 2 hours. Bones went through what she had, Harry went through what he remembered, Hermione laid out the statistical research in sections and annotated it as she went, and Ron, who had been doing his tactical backup job by listening carefully and saying nothing until the exact right moment, said, halfway through the second hour, the person who bypassed the authorization. It was someone who knew Harry specifically, wasn't it? Not just a protocol case. Someone who saw the name on the diagnostic request and made a personal decision. Bones looked at him. "Because 17 minutes isn't fast enough to process the diagnostic findings and make a policy decision," Ron said. 17 minutes is fast enough to see a name and react. He paused. And the name was Harry Potter, which means this wasn't just about the protocol. Someone wanted him in custody specifically. Bones looked at him for a long moment. "You're Arthur Weasley's son," she said. "Yeah," Ron said. "It shows," she said, and it was clearly a compliment. She didn't confirm what Ron had said, but she didn't deny it either, and the shape of the silence around it was its own answer. Somebody at the ministry had seen Harry Potter's name on a St Mungo's diagnostic report and had moved faster than procedure allowed, faster than thought, with the velocity of someone acting on something they'd already decided. Someone who wanted Harry accessible. Harry thought about that on the way back to the Burrow that afternoon, sitting at the back of the night bus with Ron and Hermione while London rearranged itself outside the windows. "Fudge," Ron said. "Probably," Harry said. "He's been trying to discredit you all summer. The prophet's been full of, Mum keeps trying to hide them but I've seen the headlines. Triwizard trauma, is Potter's testimony reliable?" That was Monday. "Before the diagnostic even, he's afraid," Hermione said. "Fudge. He's terrified of Voldemort being back because if it's true then his entire tenure as minister has been built on a false security. If Harry is discredited, the testimony about the graveyard is discredited, and Fudge doesn't have to face what's actually happening. So he jumped on the diagnostic, Harry said. The moment he saw my name on a Protocol 7 application, he saw a way to make it about you being dangerous rather than about what was done to you, Hermione said. Yes. Harry looked out the window at a red double-decker bus that had just swerved to avoid the night bus and was now sitting crossways across an intersection with its driver making gestures the night bus driver appeared to find amusing. Normal London. Normal Thursday. What's Bones going to do about Fudge? Ron asked. She's building documentation, Harry said. She needs to be able to take it to the Wizengamot in a form that survives challenge. If she moves too fast and he counters before she has everything, he buries it, Hermione said. He's minister. He controls enough of the Wizengamot to stall a proper inquiry if it isn't airtight. She paused. She knows that. That's why she's being careful. How long does careful take? Ron asked. She said she wanted to move before the end of July, Harry said. She told me that when you were getting refills. Ron looked at him. Before the end of July. That's 3 weeks. Yeah. A lot can happen in 3 weeks. I know, Harry said. Which is why Thursday is important. Ron looked at him. Dumbledore's coming Thursday. Dumbledore's coming Thursday, Harry confirmed. And we're starting the work. Ron dropped his voice slightly, which was unnecessary on a bus with Ernie the driver currently announcing their approach to the Burrow at top volume while the entire bus pitched sideways around a roundabout. The extraction. Preliminary work, Harry said. Dumbledore said preparation first. He needs to understand exactly what he's dealing with before we try anything. He paused. And I need to understand what I'm dealing with. Hermione, who had been quiet for the last few minutes and whose expression suggested she'd been holding something back, said, Harry. The extraction, removing the Horcrux fragment. Dumbledore's theory is that you have to do it yourself, yes? Essentially. And the fragment it's a piece of Voldemort's consciousness. It'll resist. Pi said that. Dumbledore said that. So when it resists, she stopped. Looked out the window. I've been reading about magical consciousness, about soul theory. It's very restricted literature but there's enough in what Dumbledore has published over the years to infer. She stopped again. Hermione, Harry said. When the fragment resists, it's going to use what it has access to, she said. Which is your memories. Your fears. The things it's been sitting next to for 13 years. She looked at him. It's going to try to use your worst moments against you. To make you flinch. To make you stop. The bus lurched. Harry held on to the overhead rail. I know, he said. You know. I've been thinking about it since Tuesday. He paused. I've had worse. I've been in a graveyard with Voldemort himself. I've watched Cedric die. I've heard my parents' voices through a wand connection. He looked at Hermione steadily. Whatever the fragment uses, I've already survived the real version. Hermione looked at him for a long time. Then she reached over and took his hand briefly, squeezed once, and let go. Not sentimental. Just, solid. The specific warmth of someone who believed you and was showing it with the economy of someone who reserved the gesture for when they meant it. All right, she said. All right, he said. The night bus deposited them at the end of the Burrows lane with a bang like a small explosion and then screamed off toward whatever emergency required its presence next. Thursday came with thin morning cloud and the smell of rain that hadn't arrived yet, and Harry was up before 6 again, but this time it wasn't the restless wakefulness of dread, it was the particular alertness of someone who had something to do and was ready to do it. Dumbledore arrived at 10, punctual to the minute, through the floor with a roll of parchment under one arm and a bag that clinked softly when he set it on the kitchen table. The bag contained files, 12 of them, various sizes, the contents ranging from clear to deep blue to something that moved slightly in the glass in a way that suggested it was either alive or adjacent to it. "Good morning," he said, and looked at Harry with the particular quality of attention that Harry had decided was Dumbledore at his best, not the performer, not the manager, just the very old, very intelligent man who cared. "Good morning," Harry said. "Tea?" "Please," Dumbledore said, and sat down. They worked at the kitchen table for 4 hours. Not the extraction, not yet. Dumbledore had been clear about that, and Harry had read enough of the journal in the 2 days since to understand why. The theoretical framework needed to be solid before any attempt was made at anything practical, because an imprecise attempt at extracting a fragment of dark magical consciousness would be, in Dumbledore's words, counterproductive in ways that would be difficult to reverse. Which was, Harry thought, an elegant way of saying catastrophic. What they did instead was map. Dumbledore had developed, over 3 years, a theoretical model of how the fragment was embedded, where it sat in relation to Harry's own magical structure, what it was connected to, what it had access to. The model was represented in a series of intricate diagrams in the journal, overlaid with annotations and cross-references that told the story of someone working through a problem from first principles with extraordinary care. Harry went through the diagrams one by one, and at each one he offered something Dumbledore hadn't had before, direct experiential data. What the scar felt like during Voldemort's moments of strong emotion. What it felt like when he attempted legilimency defense. What had happened during the wand connection in the graveyard, from the inside, not the lights and the ghosts, but the feeling of his own magic pulling taut, finding something to anchor to. Dumbledore listened to all of it and wrote in the margins of his journal with a speed that suggested he was filling gaps he'd been staring at for years. Hermione was at the table with them, which was not something Harry had asked for but which had happened anyway because Hermione had sat down with her own parchment shortly after Dumbledore arrived and Dumbledore had taken one look at her notes from Tuesday and said, "Miss Granger, your analysis of the soul resonance interaction model is, where did you find the secondary source material on Horcrux theory?" "Hogwarts library," Hermione said. "The restricted section. I have a signed permission form from Professor Lupin from 3rd year that technically still, yes, of course," Dumbledore said, with the air of someone who knew perfectly well what was happening in his school's restricted section and had decided to find it useful rather than concerning. "Please stay." Ron had taken a position at the kitchen counter with a plate of biscuits and the pragmatic recognition that the conversation at the table had exceeded his specific expertise. He refilled tea when needed, which was a genuine contribution because nobody else was tracking the kettle. At noon Molly put lunch on the table with the efficiency of someone who had accepted that her kitchen had become a research station and decided to keep everyone fed while it happened. She set plates around the diagrams and files without disturbing anything, which required genuine spatial skill, and at one point leaned over Harry's shoulder to look at a diagram and said, "Is that the scar?" And when Harry said yes she looked at it for a long moment and then straightened and went back to the counter and said nothing else. She was trying. Harry could see her trying. The specific effort of someone learning to stand next to a situation instead of managing it. It was not nothing. After lunch, Dumbledore produced the files from the bag and explained them. They were monitoring solutions, potions that, when applied to the palm, produced a faint magical signature that could be read by a skilled legilimens to assess the state of magical connectivity between a subject's core and an embedded fragment. The idea was to establish a baseline reading before any extraction work began, so that progress could be measured accurately. Harry held out his hand. Dumbledore opened one of the clear files and poured a small amount onto Harry's palm. It was warm, and it smelled faintly of something very old, not unpleasant, just deeply, almost geologically old, the smell of something that had been a long time in the making. Dumbledore pressed 2 fingers very lightly against Harry's palm and closed his eyes. The kitchen was quiet. Harry felt something, not pain, not even pressure, just awareness. The sense of being looked at from a direction he didn't have a word for. And then, from somewhere deep and dark and very familiar, the sense of something else becoming aware of being looked at. It was the smallest thing. The briefest flicker. Like something asleep turning over. Harry kept his breathing even. Dumbledore opened his eyes after 30 seconds. He looked at Harry and he said, very quietly, "It's reactive." "I felt it," Harry said. "You felt it." "It noticed." "The monitoring." Dumbledore looked at his fingers. "Remarkable," he said. "Most subjects of legilimency monitoring feel nothing. The fact that you perceived the fragment's response to the monitoring, the bloodline," Hermione said, from across the table. She was looking at her notes. "The primary magic. It's not just broadcasting outward. It's perceptive. Inward as well." Dumbledore looked at her. "Explain." "The old texts on the Emery's line," Hermione said, and slid one of her summaries across the table. "The primary magic of the original line wasn't just powerful in the conventional sense. It was perceptive in all directions simultaneously. Internal and external. The carrier could sense their own magical structure the way most wizards can't, because the magic was sophisticated enough to be self-aware." She looked at Harry. "You don't just feel the fragment because it's disturbing you. You feel it because your magic is aware of what it is." Harry sat with this for a moment. He thought about all the times he'd known things he shouldn't have been able to know. The way he'd felt the diary's influence before he'd understood what it was. The way Quirrell had always felt wrong before Harry could name why. The feeling in the graveyard, not just fear, but the specific sensation of something recognizing him across a distance. "I've always been able to feel it," he said. "I thought it was just the pain. I thought it was just the scar." "The pain is the damage the fragment does when it's active," Dumbledore said. "What you're describing is different. That's awareness." He looked at Harry steadily. "This is important. This changes the approach." "How?" Harry asked. "I had theorized that you'd need to locate the fragment internally through a blind process," Dumbledore said. "A kind of magical excavation, working inward until you found what you were looking for. If you can already perceive it," he paused. "The extraction may be more direct than I thought. Faster. Or more dangerous," Hermione said, not alarmingly, just accurately. "Both," Dumbledore agreed. "The precision required increases. But the probability of success also increases." He looked at Harry. "Do you know, right now, at this moment, where it is?" Harry closed his eyes. He stopped doing the thing he'd always done, the automatic tuning out of the scar's ambient presence that had become so habitual he'd stopped noticing he was doing it. He let himself look at it instead. There. In the scar tissue, exactly where Pi had mapped it. Sitting like, not a weight, not exactly. More like a seam. A place where two different textures of magic met each other without quite integrating. His magic, layered and old, and that constant low-frequency broadcast. And then the other thing, sitting against it like a cold stone against warm earth. "Yes," he said. "I know exactly where it is." The kitchen was very quiet. He opened his eyes. Everyone was looking at him, Dumbledore, Hermione, Ron at the counter with a biscuit forgotten in his hand, Molly in the doorway from the hall. "Good," Dumbledore said, and his voice had something in it that Harry recognized after a moment as relief so profound it had become almost inaudible. 3 years of work, and the answer to the question he'd been most afraid of had just arrived in a 10-word sentence from a 14-year-old boy in a Burrow kitchen. "When?" Harry asked. "Not today," Dumbledore said. "Not this week. You need to practice the inward perception, deliberately, controlled, so that when we begin the extraction you're not doing it for the first time under pressure. You need to become fluent with it." He paused. 2 weeks, I think. We'll meet every other day. By the end of 2 weeks, you'll know your own magical structure well enough to navigate it. And then? And then we take it out, Dumbledore said. And Voldemort will be one step closer to mortal. Harry looked at the scar on his forehead in the dark window of the kitchen cabinet across the table, just a faint reflection, the room behind him, the pale lightning bolt that had been the first thing anyone knew about him his entire life. One step closer to mortal. Both of them. That was fine. That was exactly fine. The owl from Bones came that evening, after Dumbledore had left and dinner had been eaten and the kitchen was returning to itself from the day's work. It came with a second owl directly behind it, a ministry bird, the formal kind, with the seal of the DMLE. Harry read Bones's letter first. I have the documentation I need. The authorization bypass was Cornelius Fudge, using his ministerial override code. He saw your name on the diagnostic request, forwarded to him by someone at St Mungo's I'm currently identifying, and issued the investigative hold authorization himself, within 17 minutes, without review, without secondary sign-off. I have the authorization log. I have the code record. I have Torres's contradictory report. And I have what your friend Miss Granger sent me this morning, she owed me directly, which I admire, the statistical breakdown of the Protocol 7 applications. It's enough. I'm taking it to the Wizengamot. I have a provisional hearing date, the 28th of July. 12 days. I want you there. Not as a victim. As a witness. There's a difference and I'll explain it to you beforehand. One more thing. Pi came to see me today. On his own initiative. He brought his own documentation, internal notes from the diagnostic, his personal account of the authorization process and his concerns about it, and a draft of his protocol review proposal. He also brought something else, Healer Ellsworth's formal written account of the Muggle-born child detained in 1991. The one she'd only put a note in the file about before. She'd apparently decided, after your conversation, that a note in the file was no longer sufficient. People are capable of being better than their worst moments, Mr. Potter. It's worth keeping in mind. A.B. Harry set the letter down. He picked up the Ministry Owl's scroll and broke the seal. It was the formal notification that the investigative hold order issued on July 8 had been vacated. Effective immediately. No further action required by the subject. Harry put it on the kitchen table. He picked up the Bones letter and read the last paragraph again. People are capable of being better than their worst moments. He thought about Pi, going to Bones's office on his own. He thought about Ellsworth, turning a note in a file into a formal account. He thought about Molly, sitting at the kitchen table for hours while research happened around her, keeping everyone fed, trying to learn how to stand next to things instead of managing them. He thought about Dumbledore, in a garden chair with a worn journal, saying I was afraid without flinching. He thought about all the worst moments in the last 4 days and measured them against what had also happened in those 4 days, and he found that the sum of it was, not simple. Not clean. But something. Moving, maybe. Things moving. Ron had read the letter over his shoulder. The 28th, he said. 12 days, Harry said. Wizengamot. Yeah. Are you nervous? Harry thought about it. The Wizengamot, the full court. Fudge would be there, presumably, because ministers attended Wizengamot hearings. Fudge, who had been trying to discredit him in the Prophet, who had moved in 17 minutes to put Harry in custody, who was afraid of what Harry's testimony meant for his ministry. Was he nervous? No, he said, and meant it. Ron looked at him. You should probably be at least a little nervous. Probably, Harry agreed. It'd make the rest of us feel better. Sorry, Harry said. It's fine, Ron said. It's genuinely fine. It's just, he stopped. Looked at Harry with that expression again, the one from the garden wall, from the orange room in the dark. You know what you remind me of? What? That first day on the train, Ron said. When we were 11. I showed you how to do the spell and it didn't work and you tried it and it worked straight away. Ju remember? Harry remembered. The Scabbers to Goblet spell that Ron had done wrong and Harry had gotten right on the first attempt. Yeah. You looked exactly the same, Ron said. Like you just done the thing you were supposed to do and now you were ready for whatever came next. He paused. I thought it was luck then. I don't think that anymore. Harry looked at the letters on the table. The vacated hold order and Bones's careful handwriting in 12 days. Neither do I, he said. Outside the window, the Ottery St. Catchpole evening was doing its usual unhurried gold to dark, the garden soft and warm, the clock above the fireplace showing all 9 hands pointing peacefully at home. 12 days. Chapter 6, The Boy Who Decided the Wizengamot Chamber Smelled Like Old Stone and Older Arguments. Harry had been in the Ministry of Magic before, the incident with the flu in second year, the brief administrative visits Arthur had facilitated, but he'd never been to the underground levels, the ones that existed below the polished atrium with its fountain and its gold statues. The lift went down 5 floors past the public spaces and opened onto a corridor that was narrower and colder and considerably more honest about what kind of institution this was. The walls here were rough-hewn, the torches in brackets rather than the elegant floating lights upstairs, and the sound of the lift closing behind them echoed for a long time. Bones met them at the corridor's end. She was in formal robes today, still dark navy, still plain, but heavier, the kind of formal weight that announced itself without requiring announcement. She had 3 members of her DMLE staff behind her carrying documentation in sealed cases, and behind them, looking simultaneously determined and like he'd rather be anywhere on Earth, was Augustus Pye. He'd come in his St Mungo's robes. Harry thought about that choice for a moment and decided it was the right one. He'd come as what he was, not trying to perform something else. Mr. Potter, Bones said. Ms. Bones, Harry said. He looked at the chamber door, heavy oak bound in iron, currently closed. How many? 53 Wizengamot members present. Full quorum. She paused. Fudge is in the minister's chair. Expected, Harry said. He brought his senior under-secretary. Dolores Umbridge. She said the name flatly, with the specific flatness of someone who has spent years saying a name in the company of people who understand why it requires that tone. She will attempt to interject. Don't let her. Noted, Harry said. Behind him, Ron had his arms folded and his jaw set in the way it got when he was angry and had decided to be very controlled about it. Hermione had her bag, which contained everything, copies of the research, copies of Bones's documentation, 3 different summaries organized by argument type, and a small amount of food because she believed in practical preparation. Arthur was to Harry's left in his ministry robes, because Arthur had pulled his annual leave for today and dressed with the quiet gravity of someone who understood what the day meant. Molly was not here. Harry had told her, when she'd offered, that he didn't need her to be, and she had looked at him for a moment and then nodded and said, I'll have dinner ready. That was all. No argument, no hurt, no pushing. She was learning. It was happening slowly and genuinely and Harry thought that was probably the right pace for it. Dumbledore was already inside. He had come early, because Dumbledore at significant events was like a rook settling onto a chessboard before the game had begun, deliberately positioned, radiating consequence. One more thing, Bones said, before they went in. She looked directly at Harry. You're a witness, not a subject. You don't owe this chamber an apology, an explanation, or deference. You owe them accuracy. That's all. I know, Harry said. Some of the members will try to make you feel like you're the one on trial. Let them try, Harry said. Bones looked at him for a moment. Then she turned and opened the chamber door. The Wizengamot chamber was circular, as Harry had imagined it, and tiered, the members' benches rising in concentric rows around a central floor, like a stone amphitheater built for the express purpose of making whoever stood in the middle feel observed from every angle simultaneously. The benches were nearly full, the purple-robed members arranged in their traditional seats, and the sound when the doors opened was of a room full of people who had been talking and had stopped. Harry walked into the center of the floor and looked around at them. There were the curious ones, leaning forward slightly, watching him with the open attention of people who weren't sure yet what they were seeing. There were the hostile ones, arms folded, expressions preloaded with skepticism that predated anything he'd said or done. There were the neutral ones, doing the careful public face performance of people who had already made up their minds and were waiting to see what position it was safe to reveal. And there, in the minister's chair, a chair elevated slightly above the others at the chamber's head, more throne than bench, was Cornelius Fudge. Harry had seen Fudge before, briefly, but always at a distance. Up close, Fudge was a man who had mastered the art of looking like authority without quite achieving it, the lime-green bowler hat, the expensive robes, the face that wanted to project confidence and kept slipping into something that was more accurately described as managed anxiety. He was looking at Harry with the expression of someone who had prepared for this and was discovering that preparation didn't quite cover the feeling of the actual thing. Beside him, small and very still, was Dolores Umbridge. She had a wide, flat face and small, sharp eyes and was wearing robes in a shade of pink that was aggressively cheerful in the way of something that had decided cheer was a weapon. She smiled at Harry, briefly, when he looked at her. It was the kind of smile that cats gave to birds. To Fudge's other side, at the end of the elevated row, sat Dumbledore. He was looking straight ahead with the serene attention of someone listening to music only he could hear, and he did not look at Harry, but Harry felt the quality of his presence in the room, settled, deliberate, the unmistakable weight of someone who had been in this chamber for a very long time and was not impressed by it. Madame Marchbanks, the senior Wizengamot member, presided from the topmost tier. She was ancient in the way of very old trees, past the point where age was surprising and into the territory where it simply was. She had a voice like gravel and the direct gaze of someone who had presided over enough of these to know exactly which parts mattered. "The Wizengamot is in full session," she said. "This hearing concerns the investigative hold order issued on the 8th of July, the circumstances of its issuance, and the conduct of several parties thereunto related. Ms. Bones, as petitioner, you may begin." Bones stood at the floor's edge, one of her DMLE staff beside her with the documentation cases. "Thank you, Madam Marchbanks," she said, and her voice carried through the chamber with the practiced ease of someone who had stood in rooms like this many times and had never once made it about the performance. "I'll be brief, because the evidence is its own argument." She was brief. It took her 7 minutes to lay out the core case, the diagnostic request, the authorization bypass, the 17-minute window, the deviation from mandatory review protocol, the lack of secondary sign-off. She had the authorization log copied onto large parchment that 2 of her staff held up for the chamber to see, Fudge's ministerial override code highlighted in red, the timestamp undeniable. Fudge's face went through several colors during this 7 minutes. He arrived at something between brick red and an unfortunate mauve by the end of it. "I'll also note," Bones said, "that the authorization was issued before the diagnostic findings had been reviewed by the senior DMLE official required under protocol, and before the subject had been given any opportunity to provide context for the findings." The subject being a 14-year-old boy who had returned 3 days earlier from an encounter with Voldemort, the chamber produced its usual scattered flinches at the name. In which he was used against his will as a component in a dark ritual. Bones let that sit for a moment. The diagnostic findings that triggered the hold order were, in context, evidence of a crime committed against Harry Potter. Not by him. She paused. The minister, in issuing the authorization without review, chose to treat the victim of a crime as its perpetrator. That is the substance of this petition. Silence. Then Umbridge said, "If I might," in a voice like sugar poured over something sour. "You may not," Marchbanks said. "You're here as an observer, Madam Undersecretary." "Observers observe." Umbridge smiled. "Of course," she said, and subsided, and kept smiling in the way of someone making a note for later. Marchbanks looked at the center floor. "Harry Potter," she said. "You've been asked to give testimony. Please approach." Harry walked to the exact center of the chamber floor. He turned in a slow half-circle, looking at the banked rows of purple robes and old faces, and then he stopped and stood still and looked at Marchbanks. "I'm ready," he said. "Your account," she said. "Monday morning, the 8th of July. Begin when you're comfortable." "I'm comfortable now," Harry said. He told it clearly. He'd gone over it with Bones 3 times in the past 12 days, not to rehearse but to practice the difference between accuracy and narrative, the difference between telling a story and giving evidence. He gave evidence. He stated what happened in sequence: the owl, the time, the scroll, the Aurors, the healer, the conversation at the Burrow door. He was specific about words, who said what, in what order, with what tone where tone was relevant, and he was specific about what he had been thinking when he made decisions, because Bones had told him that his decision to cooperate voluntarily rather than resist would matter in the chamber's assessment. He spoke for 9 minutes. When he finished, Marchbanks said, "Thank you." Questions from the members. The first 3 questions were from members who were, Harry identified quickly, sympathetic. They were establishing facts, confirming timeline, giving the evidence more purchase. He answered them simply and directly and moved on. The 4th question came from a thin, gray-faced member in the upper tier whose name Harry didn't know but whose tone he recognized immediately. "Mr. Potter," the member said, "the diagnostic findings. The soul resonance indicator, the Horcrux marker. Can you explain why an innocent person would have such a marker in their blood?" "Yes," Harry said. "I just did. Voldemort used my blood in a resurrection ritual. The soul resonance predates that. It arrived the night he killed my parents, as a consequence of his own killing curse rebounding. I didn't choose either event. But the marker exists." "Yes. And you can see why the presence of dark magical resonance in a subject's blood might warrant concern." "I can see why it might warrant questions," Harry said. "I can see why it might prompt a medical review or a conversation with the subject. I can't see how it warrants arresting a 14-year-old before anyone has asked him a single question about it." He paused. "Can you?" The member opened his mouth, seemed to locate something to say, and then seemed to reconsider it. "The protocol," he started. "The protocol is broken," Harry said. "Not aggressively. Not with heat. Just levelly, as a statement of demonstrable fact. That's part of what this hearing is about. Healer Pi is here. He ran my diagnostic and he's the one who submitted the formal review request for Protocol 7. Ask him." Every head in the chamber turned to where Pi was sitting at the edge of the floor, near Bones's team. He looked, Harry thought, like a man who had been dreading being looked at and had decided that dreading things was less useful than dealing with them. Marchbanks looked at him. "Healer Pi. You submitted a protocol review request." Pi stood. "Yes, Madam Marchbanks." His voice was steady. "I've submitted a preliminary review request to St Mungo's Board of Directors and a formal addendum to the DMLE requesting a joint review committee. I have documentation of statistical anomalies in the protocol's application history going back to 1965, a disproportionate number of applications against Muggle-born and first-generation magical subjects, with a high rate of false positives." He paused. "I also have a case file from 1991. A Muggle-born child detained for 2 days under the same protocol. I've submitted a formal request for that case to be reviewed and the child's record expunged." He looked at Marchbanks. "The protocol was written 79 years ago. It has never been substantively amended. Its diagnostic parameters do not reflect modern understanding of magical expression diversity." He stopped. "It needs to be rewritten. I intend to be part of that process, if the chamber is willing." Silence again. A different quality of silence than the ones before it. Umbridge said, "If I might, again." You may not, Marchbanks said again, with slightly more emphasis. A member in the middle tier, a woman with dark skin and a precise, skeptical face, someone Harry thought he recognized from Bones's description of allies on the chamber, said, Ms. Bones. The statistical analysis. Who compiled it? Bones said, a research submission from Hermione Granger, age 15, currently enrolled at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. She paused. Cross-referenced and verified by my office. A 15-year-old student compiled this? Over the course of 48 hours, Bones said. Yes. The woman looked at Hermione, who was sitting in the observer's tier beside Ron and Arthur, with an expression that managed to convey both approval and slight alarm. Hermione, who had gone pink across the cheekbones at being named, was maintaining her composure with the practiced effort of someone who had strong feelings and stronger discipline. Ron, sitting beside her, looked deeply and legitimately proud. The questioning continued for another 20 minutes. Most of it was directed at Bones and her documentation. Harry answered 3 more questions, 2 straightforward, one from a member who was clearly trying to suggest that the presence of the Horcrux marker in his blood was itself suspicious in ways that had nothing to do with how it got there, which Harry addressed with a patience that he thought was doing better work than argument would have. Then Marchbanks said, Minister Fudge. The Wizengamot would hear from you. Fudge stood. He had, Harry observed, recovered some of his composure over the course of the proceedings. The mauve had settled back to his usual florid pink, and he'd straightened in his chair, and he had the expression of a man who had prepared a speech and was going to deliver it regardless of how the room had shifted. Members of the Wizengamot, Fudge said, I acted, as I always act, in the interests of public safety. When a blood diagnostic from one of our most respected medical institutions flagged active dark magical resonance in a subject, I moved quickly because I believed the situation required it. I was not, as has been implied, motivated by Minister Fudge, Harry said. The chamber went very still. Fudge stopped. Looked at Harry. I beg your pardon. You moved in 17 minutes, Harry said. He didn't raise his voice. Standard review is 48 hours minimum. You bypassed mandatory secondary sign-off. The protocol that triggered the hold order is one you have never, in 7 years as minister, initiated a review of, despite its documented application history. He paused. Which means you either didn't know about the application history, in which case you weren't doing your job, or you did know and the protocol worked the way you wanted it to. He looked at Fudge steadily. Which is it? The chamber was not just still now. It was holding its breath. Fudge's color was doing something interesting again. He said, I don't think it's appropriate for a, which is it, minister. Umbridge was on her feet. Madam Marchbanks, the subject is addressing the minister without permission, which is against the procedural rules of, the subject, Marchbanks said, with a quietness that managed to completely fill the stone chamber, is a witness who has been invited to testify. The procedural rules allow questions from the floor. Sit down, Madam Under-Secretary. Umbridge sat. Marchbanks looked at Fudge. The question was precise, Minister. Please answer it. Fudge looked at Marchbanks, and then at the chamber, and then at Harry. And in the space of that look, Harry saw it, the moment when a man who has been performing competence for long enough that he can't always tell the difference between the performance and the thing itself runs out of room to keep performing. I acted in the public interest, Fudge said, and it came out quieter than it should have, quieter than he'd meant it to, and the quietness of it said everything the words were trying not to. The public interest, Marchbanks said. Yes. Who's public, said the woman in the middle tier who had asked about Hermione's research, and she said it with the crisp clarity of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The chamber didn't produce sound so much as a collective shift, bodies adjusting in seats, positions changing, the physical language of a room that has reached a decision without yet making it official. Harry looked at Fudge, and he thought about 17 minutes. He thought about a man sitting in his ministerial chair seeing the name Harry Potter on a diagnostic request and moving faster than thought. Not because he genuinely believed Harry was dangerous. Because Harry's testimony from the graveyard was a political problem that Harry being discredited would solve. He wasn't angry about it. He was disappointed, in the specific way that you felt disappointed by someone who wasn't a monster, who had ordinary human fear and ordinary human selfishness and had let those things govern a decision that affected other people catastrophically. Fudge wasn't a villain out of a story. He was a politician who was afraid of what the truth cost him, and that was almost worse. "I don't want him prosecuted," Harry said. Every head turned to him again. "He should face the Wisengamot censure," Harry said. "And there should be a formal inquiry on the authorization bypass." "That's right, and it should happen." He paused. "But prosecution, I'm not asking for it. I'm asking for the protocol to be fixed. For the review to happen. For Doris Crockford's case to be reopened." He looked at Marchbanks. "For every false flag under Protocol 7 to be reviewed. That's what I want from this chamber." He paused. "Not the minister's head. The actual problem fixed." The chamber was quiet. Marchbanks looked at him for a long moment with the eyes of someone who had presided over a great many hearings and was having an unusual one. "The subject is concise," she said. "Thank you," Harry said. "It wasn't a compliment," she said. "It was an observation." But the corner of her ancient mouth moved slightly. "Voting members. The petition before us is threefold. First, formal censure of the minister for violation of investigative hold authorization protocol. Second, mandatory review of St Mungo's Diagnostic Protocol 7 under a joint committee including Healer Pie and nominated DMLE representatives. Third, case review for all Protocol 7 applications resulting in subject detention, going back to 1965. She looked around the chamber. Hands for the first. 41 hands. Hands against. 9. 3 abstentions. Carried, Marchbanks said. Second. 47 hands. Carried. Third. 44 hands. Carried, Marchbanks said. The petition is upheld. This chamber is adjourned. The sound that followed was not dramatic. It was the sound of a room full of people exhaling and beginning to talk, the individual conversation starting up over each other in the way that public proceedings became human again at their conclusions. Harry stood in the center of the floor while it happened around him, and he looked at the high stone ceiling and thought about Doris Crockford, 6 months in Azkaban for having strong magic, and the thought sat in his chest cold and specific, and this was the part that wasn't over, this was the part that was going to take the years that came after this day. But it was started. Bones was at his elbow. "Well done," she said. "You did the work," Harry said. "We did the work," she said, and looked at him with the expression she'd had at the leaky cauldron, the one that was calibrating. "You should know, the censure means a formal inquiry. The inquiry will be uncomfortable for the minister. He'll come out of it, probably, but he won't come out of it easily, and he'll spend the next year looking over his shoulder." She paused. "He's also not going to take that graciously." "I know," Harry said. "He'll continue to try to discredit you. In the Prophet, in the public forum." "Let him," Harry said. "I have other things to work on." Bones looked at him. "The extraction," she said. She knew, he'd told her, when they'd met the previous week, because she'd asked directly about the diagnostic findings and he'd decided that Amelia Bones was someone whose knowing was an asset. "How is that progressing?" "Every other day with Dumbledore," Harry said. 2 more weeks, he thinks. "And you?" Harry thought about the practice sessions, the quiet mornings in the Burrow garden before anyone else was up, the deliberate inward focus, the feeling of navigating his own magical structure like learning the rooms of a house in the dark. The seam where the fragment sat, cold and old, and occasionally, when he got close enough, briefly restless. He'd gotten better at approaching it. Better at staying steady when it stirred. "Sooner than 2 weeks," he said. Bones looked at him for a long moment. "I'll want to know how it goes," she said. "Not officially. Just, I'll want to know." "I'll tell you," he said. Across the chamber, Fudge was being escorted by 2 of his own officials toward the side exit, and his face had the look of a man who had just watched something he'd built carefully begin to come apart in ways he hadn't predicted. Umbridge, walking just behind him, caught Harry's eye as she passed. She smiled again. The cat and bird smile. Harry looked at her and thought about Bones's warning, "He won't take this graciously," and thought about what form ungracious took when the weapon was someone like Umbridge. He filed it. Not a problem for today. Today's problems were done. Pi was standing near the chamber door, and Harry crossed to him. "The Joint Committee," Harry said. Pi nodded. "I got the formal confirmation from Bones's office this morning. We have our first meeting in 2 weeks. He paused. "I was going to ask, would you be willing to come? As a consultation. Not officially, not as a patient. Just, you have a perspective on the protocol that no one on the committee has." "Yes," Harry said. "Send me the date." Pi held out his hand. Harry shook it. "For what it's worth," Pi said, quietly, "I think you may be the most unusual patient I've ever processed." "I wasn't a patient," Harry said. "You never actually treated me." Pi almost smiled. "No," he said. "I didn't." He paused. "I'd like to, someday. Properly. With your consent." He paused again. "I think your magical structure, over the next several years, I think it's going to be something worth understanding." "I think you're probably right," Harry said. He let Pi go and turned and found Ron immediately, which was never difficult. Ron was always findable, being generally taller than the surrounding crowd and currently wearing the expression of someone managing an extremely strong emotion with limited success. "Well," Ron said. "Well," Harry said. 41, Ron said. "On the censure." "Yeah. That's most of them." "Yeah." Ron looked around the chamber, which was emptying in the general direction of the various exits, the purple robes dispersing, voices rising to conversational levels. "My dad's crying," he said, in a low, informational tone. Harry looked. Arthur was standing with Hermione near the observer's tier and he was, indeed, crying in the quiet, controlled way of someone who had decided that the appropriate response to a significant moment was to let themselves feel it and then move on. Hermione had her hand on his arm and was looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone also feeling something they decided to label analytical satisfaction because that was less destabilizing than the real name for it. Harry walked over to them. Arthur looked at him, and the thing on his face was so uncomplicated and genuine that Harry had to look away briefly, at the stone floor, at his own shoes, and then back. "Thank you," Arthur said. "For letting me be here." "Thank you for coming," Harry said. "Harry," Arthur said, and then seemed to run out of words and put his hand on Harry's shoulder instead, and that was enough, that covered everything that the words would have been trying to say. Hermione cleared her throat. "The committee is formed," she said, with only a slight thickness to her voice. "Protocol review commences in 2 weeks. Bones has the case files. Pi is officially on the committee." She paused. "We got everything." "We got everything," Harry agreed. "There's still Voldemort," she said. "I know. And the extraction." "I know. And Fudge is going to be, Hermione," Harry said. "I know." He looked at her. "Can we have 10 minutes where we're pleased with today before we start on tomorrow?" She opened her mouth, and then she smiled, actually smiled, full and real, the smile she reserved for moments when something went right in a way she'd worked for. 10 minutes, she said. "Fine. Thank you." They came out of the ministry into late afternoon London, the Muggle crowds moving past the phone box entrance in the cheerful, indifferent way of Muggles who had no idea that underground the wizarding world had just done something that mattered, and Harry stood on the pavement and let the city be loud around him for a moment. The sun was doing its July thing, warm without quite being generous, the light coming sideways off the buildings, the particular London gold of late afternoons in summer. A bus went past. Someone was selling flowers from a cart 20 yards down the street. A child on the opposite pavement was dragging a parent toward an ice cream stand with the specific focused intensity of someone who had a very clear sense of mission. Normal. Just completely, improbably normal. Ice cream? Ron said. Yes, Harry said immediately. They got ice cream from the Muggle stand, the proper kind, Mr. Whippy from a machine, which Ron always regarded with a mixture of suspicion and delight because the flake on top confounded him on a philosophical level, and they sat on a low wall in the afternoon sun while Arthur went to use the telephone to ring Molly, and Hermione ate hers with the precise, satisfied focus of someone who had earned it. Harry ate his and thought about nothing in particular, which was its own very specific luxury. After a while Hermione said, "Can I say something?" "Go on," Harry said. "You told the chamber you didn't want Fudge prosecuted." She was looking at her ice cream rather than at him. "A lot of people would have." "Most people, probably." "Maybe," Harry said. "Why didn't you?" He thought about it. He'd been thinking about it since he'd said it, in the odd recursive way that you thought about things you'd done instinctively and then went back to examine the instinct. "Because prosecuting Fudge is about Fudge," he said. "And this isn't about Fudge. Fudge is a symptom." He paused. "The protocol. The application history. Doris Crockford. That's the actual problem. Fudge goes, someone else sits in that chair, and if the protocol is still broken, it still does the same thing to the next person." He licked his ice cream. "Fix the thing, not the person." Hermione was quiet for a moment. "That's very mature," she said. "Don't make it weird," Harry said. "I'm not making it weird," she said. "I'm just noting it." "Noted," he said. Ron, who had been demolishing his ice cream with focused efficiency, said, "The flake doesn't make sense." "The flake is the best part," Harry said. "But what is it?" Ron said. "It's not chocolate." "Not really. It's like chocolate that aspired to be something else and gave up halfway." "That's exactly what it is," Harry said. "That's the point." Ron looked at the flake. "Ate it." "Yeah, all right," he said. "It's good." He did the extraction 11 days later. Not 2 weeks, as Dumbledore had estimated. 11 days, because by the 9th day of practice Harry could navigate his own magical structure with his eyes closed and one hand tied behind him, metaphorically speaking, and on the 10th day he'd gotten close enough to the fragment that it had stirred properly for the first time, not the brief flicker of the monitoring session, but a genuine waking response, a cold pressure that moved against him like something pushing back, and he'd held his ground through it, and it had subsided, and he'd thought, tomorrow. He told Dumbledore that morning when the old man arrived at the Burrow, and Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment and then said, "All right," and set the bag down. They used the garden. Dumbledore's suggestion, open air, natural ground, the kind of space that had always been used for magic before rooms existed. Harry sat cross-legged in the grass with the sun coming through the hedge in bright bars and Dumbledore sitting opposite him, close enough to reach him if needed, and the household at his back. Ron was at the kitchen window. He'd said he wasn't going to watch, and he was watching. Harry had decided not to mention it. "Ready," Harry said. "Not a question." "Whenever you are," Dumbledore said. Harry closed his eyes. He went inward the way he'd practiced, not a dive, not an assault, just a turning of attention. His own magical structure was familiar to him now in the way that a house becomes familiar, the specific shapes of it, the way his magic moved in its own channels, always slightly different from the theoretical textbook descriptions because he was not a textbook case of anything. The inheritance markers were a warmth, deep and layered, he'd gotten used to them, the old stone feeling of something that predated everything around it. The Parseltongue encoding was a texture, woven through everything, the language that his magic had always thought in without him knowing that's what it was doing. The broadcasting signal was something he could feel in a way he hadn't been able to before the practice, a constant low hum, outward-facing, the frequency that Pi had called a warding signal. And there, at the edge of the scar tissue, in the specific cold seam he'd mapped 14 times, the fragment. He approached it slowly. Not trying to hide. The thing about trying to hide from something inside your own head was that it never worked, it had access to everything he was thinking, everything he was feeling, every strategy he formed. So he didn't hide. He just moved toward it deliberately, with the full weight of his own presence, the way you move toward something you intended to handle. It woke up. He felt it, the cold thing turning, orienting, the sense of something ancient and dark becoming aware of something it had been sitting next to for 13 years finally looking directly at it. And then it pushed. Not physically. Nothing in his body changed, no pain, no external sign of anything. Ron at the window saw him sitting still in the grass with his eyes closed. But inside, in the space where he was doing the work, the fragment pushed with everything it had. His worst memories. The ones it had been sitting next to for 13 years. His aunt's voice, on the stairs, freak. The cupboard under the stairs, the dark and the small dimensions of it, the specific quality of the dark that comes from being locked in rather than from the absence of light. His uncle's hands. Dudley's friends at school, the game called Harry hunting. The mirror of Eriste and the figures of his parents standing behind him and the understanding that the mirror was the closest he'd ever get. Cedric, surprised. The green light. His mother's voice crying not Harry, please, he breathed. Not the content of the memories. He didn't fight the content. He let them move through him like weather, present, real, already survived. He wasn't in the cupboard. He wasn't at the mirror. He wasn't in the graveyard. He was in the Burrow garden with grass under him and the sun on his face and 11 days of practice making him fluent in his own interior, and the fragment could use everything it had and it was still using things he'd already gotten through. He kept moving. Closer, the way you moved toward something when you were the one doing the moving and it wasn't. The fragment pushed harder. New strategy, not memories, something else. A voice. Voldemort's voice, from the graveyard, from the wand connection, from every nightmare Harry had ever half remembered. You will lose everything, the voice said, in the cold interior space. You will fail, you will fall, everyone you love, no, Harry said, quietly, in the garden. Just out loud, just one word, because speaking it made it more real and real was what he needed to be right now. Dumbledore opened his eyes briefly, assessed, and closed them again. Harry reached the fragment. He could feel it clearly, the cold, the wrongness, the thing that didn't belong in him and had never belonged in him, sitting against his own magic the way a splinter sat against flesh. Pi's word. He'd been right. Not a root. A splinter. He gathered the Parseltongue encoded magic, the structural language of his own magical self, the oldest thing in him, and he used it the way he'd been learning to use it. Not as a weapon. As a language. He spoke to the fragment in the only language it understood and he said, in every way that wasn't words, "You're leaving now." The fragment resisted one more time. A surge, cold and vicious, aimed at the center of him, and he held. He held with everything he had, with the Merlin bloodline and the warding frequency and 11 days of practice and 4 years of surviving things that should have killed him, and he held, and then, it separated. Not an explosion. Not a dramatic shattering. It came loose the way a splinter comes loose, with a sudden release of pressure, and he caught it, held it, separate from himself for the first time in 13 years, and then he pushed it out. The scar burned. One moment, sharp and white and brief. And then it stopped. Harry opened his eyes. The garden was warm and green and the hedge was filtering the afternoon light and a gnome somewhere in the vegetable patch was making its usual grievances known. The rooks were in the trees. The household clock above the kitchen window was, presumably, showing everyone at home. His scar didn't hurt. It had never, in 14 years of his life, not hurt in some background way. He'd gotten so used to it that he'd stopped registering it as pain and catalogued it as simply the ambient condition of existing. And now it didn't. And the absence of it was so new and so total that he sat very still in the grass for a moment just to make sure he wasn't imagining it. He wasn't imagining it. Dumbledore was looking at him. "Well?" Harry said. Dumbledore raised his wand and performed a quiet diagnostic. A blue-white light that moved across Harry's face, paused at the scar, and returned to Dumbledore's wand. He looked at the reading on the tip of the wand. He looked at Harry. "It's gone," Dumbledore said. "Not theater. Just fact. Clean and simple and enormous." Harry nodded slowly. He looked at his hands in the grass. He flexed his fingers. He thought about the fragment, separate now, outside of him, dissolved in the process of being expelled. It hadn't survived the extraction, because it wasn't anchored the way an object Horcrux was anchored. It needed its host to survive and it no longer had one. It was simply gone. "Voldemort," Harry said. "Is now mortal," Dumbledore said. "Fully. Whatever else he has made, whatever else we have yet to find and deal with, you are no longer one of them." He paused. "He can be killed. By conventional means, by any sufficiently powerful magic. The last protection he had against ordinary mortality is gone." Harry sat with that for a moment. The last protection he had against ordinary mortality is gone. He hadn't done it for Voldemort. He'd done it for himself, for the 11-year-old who'd never had a word for what was wrong with his scar, for the 14-year-old who'd watched a Horcrux theory reflected in a diagnostic chart and felt it land not as new information but as recognition. He'd done it because it was his, it was inside him, and he'd decided that everything that lived inside him would do so with his knowledge and his consent. The side effect, that it made Voldemort mortal, was genuinely significant. Harry was not going to pretend otherwise. But it was the side effect, not the point. "Harry." Ron's voice, from the kitchen doorway. He'd apparently abandoned the window and come outside at some point. He was standing at the kitchen step with his hands in his pockets, and he had the look he'd had on the wall before, the one that contained things he couldn't quite articulate. Did it, yeah, Harry said. "It's done." Ron crossed the garden and sat in the grass beside him, and didn't say anything, which was exactly the right response. Dumbledore rose and went toward the house, quietly, because he had the understanding to recognize when he was peripheral to a moment. He paused at the door and looked back at Harry. "You did it yourself," he said. "As I said you would." "You helped," Harry said. "I provided the framework," Dumbledore said. "The work was yours." He paused. "I find that I am very glad you know that." He went inside. Ron looked at the hedge for a while. Harry looked at the sky. A rook landed on the garden wall and regarded them with the professional suspicion of a bird that had seen too much to be impressed by humans sitting in gardens, and then left. "The scar," Ron said eventually. "Still there," Harry said. "Obviously. 13 years of scar tissue doesn't go anywhere." But nothing in it," Harry said. "Yeah." Ron absorbed this. "How does it feel?" Harry thought about how it felt. He thought about the scar and the broadcasting signal and the Merlin bloodline and the diagnostic chart and Bones and the Wizengamot and Molly at the kitchen table and Pi Inesti. Mungo's green and Hermione filling parchment at midnight and the gnomes on fire and the orange room and Ron in the garden wall lobbing things at a scarecrow 3 weeks ago when all of this was just beginning. He thought about the cupboard under the stairs and what it had preserved, accidentally, by being too small and too dark to teach him the right way to be small. He thought about Doris Crockford, who still needed her record expunged, and the Protocol 7 committee, and Fudge's managed anxiety, and Umbridge's cat smile, and all the things that were still wrong and were going to keep being wrong until someone did the slow, unglamorous work of making them less wrong. He thought about Voldemort, somewhere, mortal now. Not finished. Not removed. Still dangerous, still real, still the defining problem of the decade ahead. Just, diminished, fractionally, because a boy in a garden had decided to take back what was his. He thought about Thursday and the next Thursday and every Thursday after, whatever they brought. Honest answer? Harry said. When have I ever wanted anything else? Ron said. It feels like a beginning, Harry said. Ron considered this. The afternoon moved around them, gold and unhurried, the kind of July that didn't care about Horcruxes or Wisengamot hearings or the very old things living in people's blood. Just afternoon. Just summer. Just the garden. Yeah, Ron said. I think that's about right. The kitchen door opened and Molly appeared with 2 cups of tea, and she crossed the garden to them without fuss and set the cups down in the grass, not a demonstration, not an apology, just tea, just practicality, just the most Molly possible response to a significant moment, and she looked at Harry and he looked at her and she said, "All right?" Getting there, Harry said. For the second time, to her. But differently. With a different weight behind it. She nodded once. She didn't try to hug him. She went back to the kitchen, and the screen door swung closed, and through the kitchen window Harry could see the clock on the wall, all 9 hands. All pointing at home. He drank his tea. Somewhere above London, Amelia Bones was building something that would take years to finish. Somewhere in a research suite at St Mungo's, Augustus Pye was writing something that would matter to people who hadn't been born yet. Somewhere, no one knew where, that was still the problem. Voldemort was mortal and didn't know why, and wouldn't know until someone got around to telling him with a wand. And here, in the garden of a house that leaned sideways and smelled of bread and never quite ran out of room for one more person, Harry Potter drank his tea in the grass and felt the particular quality of a life that had stopped being something done to him and started being something he was doing. The scar on his forehead caught the afternoon light. It was just a scar. Finally. Just a scar.